In the shadows of Moses' towering legacy, there is one woman's quiet strength that shaped the course of Israel's destiny. Zipporah, a name barely spoken, carries a profound mystery. What role did she truly play in the miracles of the Exodus? And what secrets did her silence hold? Zipporah's life before meeting Moses was shaped by her unique heritage and the customs of her people in the ancient world of Midian. As the daughter of Jethro, a respected priest of Midian, Zipporah was born into a life filled with religious and cultural significance. Midian, a desert region situated along trade routes, was a place where different cultures converged, and the Midianites themselves were known for their nomadic lifestyle, living in tents and traveling with their flocks. Their beliefs were rooted in the worship of various gods, with Jethro serving as a priest who guided his people in spiritual matters, offering wisdom and leadership. Zipporah, raised within this environment, would have learned the traditions of her people early in life. The customs of the Midianites emphasized hospitality, and the well, a central location in the community, was often a gathering place for people to meet and interact. It was here that Zipporah's life would take a dramatic turn, as it was at a well where she would first encounter Moses. Before this moment, Zipporah's life was focused on the day-to-day responsibilities of a daughter, tending to the needs of her family, and perhaps assisting her father in his priestly duties. Her world was one of simplicity, surrounded by the harsh desert landscape, yet rich in spiritual depth. Life in Midian was often about survival, as well as maintaining the cultural and religious practices that had sustained her people for generations. Her family's life was centered on the worship of God, and Jethro's wisdom was a beacon of guidance for the community. It is likely that Zipporah, like other daughters in the household, played a role in supporting her father's work, while also contributing to the family's sustenance. Her background as the daughter of a priest would have given her a certain status within her tribe, but her life was not one of luxury. Instead, it was shaped by the nomadic rhythms of the Midianite people, where every day was marked by the constant movement of their herds and the search for water. In the years leading up to her meeting Moses, Zipporah's life was already one of responsibility, where she was learning the ways of her people, their beliefs, and the deep connections to the land that sustained them. Yet, this world would soon be interrupted by the arrival of Moses, a man fleeing from Egypt, who would change her life forever. Moses' early life was marked by extraordinary events that set the stage for his pivotal role in the history of the Israelites. Born in a time of great oppression for the Hebrew people, Moses' birth was a moment of defiance against the harsh decree of Pharaoh, who had ordered all male Hebrew infants to be killed. His mother, Jochebed, hid him for 3 months, determined to protect him. When she could no longer conceal him, she placed him in a basket and set it afloat on the Nile River, hoping against hope that the child would survive. Fate intervened when Pharaoh's daughter discovered the basket, and moved by compassion, she adopted the infant as her own. Moses grew up in the royal palace, unaware of his true heritage, raised as the grandson of Pharaoh himself. As a young man, Moses began to grasp the depth of the suffering endured by his people. His heart was heavy with the injustice that surrounded him, and one day, his anger led him to act. Witnessing an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave, Moses intervened, killing the Egyptian in a fit of rage. Realizing that his actions had been discovered, Moses fled Egypt, seeking safety in the vast desert. It was here, in the wilderness, that Moses would begin the long exile that would shape his destiny. Moses wandered through the desert for many years, seeking refuge and purpose. His journey took him to the land of Midian, where he met Jethro, the priest of Midian, and was welcomed into his household. Moses married Jethro's daughter, Zipporah, and started a new life in the desert. For a time, Moses was content, working as a shepherd and raising a family. Yet, even in this quiet existence, God's plan for Moses was unfolding. The exile that had seemed like an end was, in truth, a preparation for the mission that would change the course of history. It was in this desert, far from Egypt's grandeur, that Moses would hear God's voice calling him from the burning bush. setting him on the path that would lead him back to Egypt to confront Pharaoh and deliver the Israelites from slavery. His time in Midian, though peaceful, was not the end of his journey, but rather a divine pause before the monumental task that awaited him. Moses' encounter with Zipporah occurred in a moment of both chance and divine providence. It was at a well, a place that held much cultural significance in the ancient world, particularly in the desert regions. Wells were not just sources of water, they were gathering places where families, travelers, and shepherds came together to draw water for their flocks. The well served as a backdrop to many important social interactions, and for Moses, it would be the setting for an encounter that would change the course of his life. Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro, the priest of Midian, had come to the well with her sisters to water their father's sheep. As daughters of a priest, their lives were shaped by the traditions and customs of their people, and the well was one of the few places where they could tend to the needs of their father's flock. The task, however, was not without its challenges. As they attempted to draw water, they were interrupted by a group of shepherds who sought to take advantage of the well for their own flocks. This was a common occurrence in such a setting, where competition for the water was fierce. However, Zipporah and her sisters, undeterred by the interruption, stood their ground. It was in this moment that Moses, who was passing by after his long journey through the desert, saw the sisters in distress. His sense of justice and his protective nature took over, and he intervened. Without hesitation, he confronted the shepherds and drove them away, ensuring that Zipporah and her sisters were able to draw water for their flock in peace. His actions were those of a man who had known injustice and felt compelled to act when he saw others suffer. Afterward, Zipporah and her sisters returned home to their father, Jethro, and shared the story of the stranger who had helped them. Impressed by Moses' actions, Jethro invited him to stay with them. It was an act of hospitality that was common in the desert, where travelers often depended on the kindness of others for survival. Over time, Moses and Zipporah grew closer, their initial meeting blossoming into a deeper connection. Moses, who had been wandering alone for so long, found solace and companionship in Zipporah, and she, in turn, found a protector and provider in him. In a world shaped by harshness and survival, their meeting at the well marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that would bring them together as husband and wife, and ultimately tie Moses to the land of Midian, where he would find a new purpose before being called back to Egypt for the mission that awaited him. Moses and Zipporah's marriage was not the traditional courtship of the ancient world, yet it was one that grew from deep respect, mutual understanding, and divine intervention. After Moses' act of protection at the well, where he had defended Zipporah and her sisters from the shepherds, the bond between Moses and Zipporah began to take shape. When Zipporah returned home and shared the story of the stranger who had helped them, her father Jethro saw the strength and character in Moses. It wasn't just Moses' courage that impressed Jethro, but also the quiet wisdom in his eyes, a wisdom born from years of exile and struggle. Jethro, wise in his years, understood the importance of hospitality and kinship, and so he extended an invitation to Moses to stay with them in Midian, offering him a home and a place of peace. It wasn't long before Jethro, seeing the bond growing between Moses and Zipporah, decided to make a formal proposal. In the customs of Midian, marriage was a union not just between two individuals, but between their families. Jethro, recognizing that Moses had both the character and the resilience needed to be part of their family, offered his daughter's hand in marriage. Moses, though reluctant to bring his past into their new life, accepted the proposal. His life as a prince of Egypt felt like a distant memory, far removed from the simplicity of shepherding in the quiet, arid lands of Midian. Yet, in that moment, he saw the opportunity for redemption, for starting anew, away from the burdens of his past. Moses and Zipporah's wedding was simple but filled with significance. It reflected the customs of Midian, where union was celebrated not through grandeur, but through heartfelt ceremony, with blessings spoken over the couple by family and community. The act of marriage between Moses and Zipporah was not just an agreement. It was a melding of two worlds. Moses, who had once known the opulence of the Egyptian court, now embraced the modesty of life in Midian, working alongside Zipporah's family as a shepherd. His days were spent tending to flocks, learning the rhythms of the land, the patience of a shepherd's life, and the simple joys of nature. Through it all, Zipporah proved to be a steadfast companion. She shared in the hard work of their life together, offering not only the comfort of her presence, but the strength of her own heritage. Her quiet wisdom, drawn from her father, helped guide Moses as he adjusted to this new way of life. They were partners, both in the work and in the moments of peace they found in each other's company. The simple, humble life they built together in Midian became a place of refuge for Moses, a place where he could begin to heal from the weight of his past and grow into the leader he was yet to become. Their marriage, marked by faith and unity, was the foundation for the transformative journey that lay ahead for both of them. Moses and Zipporah's life in Midian, though simple, was a profound departure from the life Moses had once known in Egypt. It was a life rooted in quiet reflection, hard work, and a deep connection to the land. Moses, having fled Egypt, found solace in the steady rhythm of tending to sheep, a stark contrast to the courtly life he had once enjoyed. The days were long and filled with the humbling tasks of shepherding, but they offered him something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. Zipporah, his wife, played a central role in this life. Her presence was steady and nurturing, balancing Moses' introspection with a strength that came from her own upbringing in Midian. As the daughter of Jethro, the priest of Midian, Zipporah was not only Moses' partner but also a bridge to the culture and traditions of her people. She had grown up in the simplicity of Midian, learning the ways of her father, who was a wise and respected figure in their community. Jethro's influence on Zipporah was evident in the way she handled their household, ensuring that the needs of their home were met while maintaining a sense of tranquility. The relationship between Zipporah and her father, Jethro, was one of mutual respect and love. Jethro, who had welcomed Moses into his home, now watched over the young couple with the same care he extended to his daughters. He saw in Moses not only a man of wisdom but also a man in need of guidance, someone who had been broken by his past but was slowly finding his way. The bond between father and son-in-law grew over time, with Moses learning much from Jethro's wisdom and experience, especially in matters of leadership and faith. Jethro, though initially wary of Moses' past, grew to appreciate his character and strength. It was in Midian that Moses began to shape himself into the man who would later become the leader of the Israelites. Their life together in Midian, though marked by simplicity, was one of peace. There was no grand wealth or worldly success, but there was a contentment born of purpose and connection to both family and the land. The evenings were spent in quiet conversation, the fire flickering softly as Moses and Zipporah shared their thoughts on the days that had passed. Moses, still carrying the weight of his past, found comfort in the steady rhythm of their days. There was something healing in the way the land stretched out before them, vast and silent, offering space for Moses to reflect on his journey. His bond with Zipporah deepened in these moments, as they grew together not just as a couple but as co-partners in the life they had chosen. In many ways, their life in Midian was a retreat, a necessary pause before Moses' true calling would awaken. It was here, in the quiet solitude of Midian, that Moses would prepare for the great task ahead, one that would lead him back to Egypt and forever change the course of history. Moses had spent years living a life of quiet reflection in Midian, a life that seemed worlds away from the chaos of Egypt. But that peace was shattered one fateful day when he encountered the burning bush on Mount Horeb. As Moses approached the bush, drawn by its strange and consuming fire that didn't burn, he heard a voice call his name. It was a voice he recognized as divine, a voice that spoke with authority and love. God had chosen Moses for a task far greater than he had ever imagined: to return to Egypt and free the Israelites from bondage. The calling was clear, and it pierced through Moses' quiet life, demanding action. The shock of it hit him like a wave. He stood there, unable to comprehend the enormity of the mission, questioning how he, someone who had fled Egypt in fear, could be the one to confront Pharaoh and lead his people to freedom. God's instructions were unyielding, and Moses felt both a deep sense of inadequacy and a reluctant obedience. He was being thrust back into the world he had left behind, a world he thought he had escaped forever. The enormity of the task ahead filled him with both dread and purpose. When Moses returned to Zipporah, he could not hide the storm brewing inside him. She could see the tension in his eyes, the weight on his shoulders. He tried to explain, though words seemed insufficient. Moses shared with her the encounter he had had with God, the overwhelming revelation that he was to return to Egypt and confront Pharaoh. Zipporah listened quietly, her face a mixture of concern and confusion. She knew her husband well enough to see that this was not a decision made lightly. Moses was torn between the life he had built with her in Midian and the call that seemed to demand everything from him. As the days passed, Zipporah's unease grew. The calling that had come to Moses had placed them at a crossroads. She had always known that Moses was destined for something great, but she never imagined it would pull him away from her and their life in Midian. Zipporah had been Moses's quiet strength, his anchor, and now she was faced with the possibility of losing him to a mission that seemed so far removed from the peaceful life they had built. Her own heart was torn. Though she understood that God's will was beyond comprehension, Zipporah felt the first stirrings of tension between them. Moses's focus on his divine calling began to overshadow their shared life. She feared for his safety, for the dangers that awaited him in Egypt, and for the future they had once dreamed of together. It was a silent, unspoken tension, a rift that would slowly widen as Moses prepared for his journey. Though Zipporah supported him, her heart ached with the uncertainty of what was to come. Moses was no longer just her husband. He was a man chosen by God, and that choice meant something far greater than their life together in Midian. Moses's decision to return to Egypt was no easy one. The familiar comforts of Midian now seemed distant, as if they belonged to another life entirely. He had lived with Zipporah for many years, building a home and family. But the call from God could not be ignored. With a heavy heart, Moses gathered his family, Zipporah and their 2 sons, and set out from Midian, bound for a land that was both his birthplace and the place of his deepest fears. The journey through the desert was grueling, the heat relentless. Every step felt like a test of endurance, both for Moses and for Zipporah. The desert, a vast and unyielding expanse, stretched endlessly before them. The harsh winds and barren landscape made the journey feel like an endless trial. Zipporah, though weary and unsure, never questioned Moses. Her loyalty to him was steadfast, though her thoughts remained clouded with doubt. She could not help but wonder if they were making the right decision, leaving behind the quiet life they had known for the uncertain dangers that awaited them in Egypt. The days blurred together, each one filled with fatigue and uncertainty. Zipporah kept her thoughts to herself, offering Moses quiet support. She knew he was driven by a purpose much larger than their life together in Midian. Yet, she couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at her heart. She had always known that Moses was destined for something great, but this was no longer the man she had married, the shepherd of Midian. Now, he was a messenger of God, carrying the weight of divine instruction, and with that weight came a burden she was not sure she could fully share. As they pressed forward, Moses faced the internal struggle of returning to a land where his past sins had nearly cost him his life. His memories of Egypt, of the man he had once been, haunted him. Yet, the divine call was undeniable. He had been chosen for a purpose, one that could not be ignored. Zipporah, too, carried a silent weight. Her doubts were not rooted in Moses's calling, but in the uncertainties of the path ahead. She had always been his companion, but now she was unsure of her place in this new chapter. She watched him with concern, his eyes focused on the journey ahead, but there was a growing distance between them. It was not a distance of words, but of purpose. Moses was preparing to face Pharaoh, to confront his fears and his past, and Zipporah's role seemed unclear. As the journey wore on, Zipporah's doubts were met with the stillness of the desert. There were no words that could undo the weight of the decision that had been made. But with each passing day, Zipporah walked beside Moses, her quiet support unwavering, even as the path before them became more treacherous. The desert was a place of testing, and she, like Moses, was being tested in ways she never imagined. As Moses and Zipporah continued their arduous journey, a strange and terrifying event occurred that threatened to undo everything they had set out to accomplish. It began as an inexplicable moment of divine anger, an event so sudden and so terrifying that Moses himself could not understand its cause. One night, as they made camp in the desert, Moses found himself gravely ill. It was as though an unseen force was closing in on him, and he realized, with a chilling certainty, that God was angry with him. In that moment of weakness, Moses was struck by something far worse than any physical ailment. He was in the grip of divine judgment. Zipporah, who had never fully understood the complexities of Moses's mission, was bewildered by his condition. She had witnessed the courage and certainty in her husband when he had spoken of his divine calling, but now she saw him at his most vulnerable, unable to protect himself or explain what was happening. It was a moment of silent fear between them, as Moses lay struggling for breath and Zipporah's mind raced with confusion. It was then that the reason for God's anger became clear. Moses had failed to properly circumcise his son, a task that was deeply tied to the covenant between God and the descendants of Abraham. This oversight, however unintended, had left Moses and his family vulnerable. It was a symbol of disobedience, a failure to follow the laws set out for their people, and as a result, Moses's life was at risk. In an instant, Zipporah understood what needed to be done. She did not hesitate. Without any more words, she took her son, prepared the sharp stone, and quickly performed the circumcision herself. Her hands moved quickly, urgently, as she sought to rectify what had been left undone. It was a moment of raw, desperate action, with the weight of Moses's life hanging in the balance. As soon as the ritual was completed, Zipporah took the blood and touched it to Moses's feet, invoking the covenant. With that, the divine anger seemed to lift, and Moses was miraculously spared. The sickness that had overtaken him ebbed away as swiftly as it had come. For Zipporah, this moment was one of profound significance. She had saved Moses's life, but she had also become a central figure in a story that had been unfolding for generations. Her quick thinking and decisive actions had ensured the continuation of the mission God had entrusted to her husband. Though she had never fully understood the weight of Moses's calling, she now saw her own part in it more clearly. The incident served as a reminder of the sacred covenant that bound Moses, his family, and their future, and Zipporah was reminded that sometimes the most significant moments came in the quiet, urgent actions that were required without explanation or fanfare. Moses's arrival back in Egypt was a moment of profound transformation, one that was met with a mixture of anticipation, fear, and uncertainty. The land that had once been his home now felt distant and foreign, as though the years he had spent in the desert had created an unbridgeable gap between the man he had been and the man he had become. The weight of his mission pressed heavily upon him. He had returned, not as a fugitive, but as a messenger of God, tasked with confronting Pharaoh and leading the Israelites out of bondage. Yet, with this weight came a daunting realization: the people he had left behind were not the same as the ones he had known. They were weary, oppressed, and skeptical. As Moses prepared to face the Pharaoh, Zipporah stood by him, though she remained, as always, in the shadows of his destiny. She had never asked for this life, this journey fraught with danger, uncertainty, and divine wrath, but she was steadfast. Her role was not that of a public figure, but of a quiet support, offering the strength and practicality that Moses needed to carry out his mission. In a way, Zipporah had become a stabilizing force in a life filled with chaos and upheaval. She had learned to live with Moses's calling, though it was not always easy. There were moments when she longed for the peace and simplicity of their days in Midian. But she knew that what was happening now was greater than anything she could have imagined. Zipporah's relationship with Moses' brother, Aaron, was one of mutual respect, though it was not without its own complexities. Aaron, who had been Moses' partner in the task set before them, was a man of different temperament and background. Where Moses was once the reluctant prophet, burdened with doubts and fears, Aaron had always been the more outspoken and confident of the two. Their shared mission created a bond, yet it was one that was tested by differing perspectives. Moses' return to Egypt with Aaron by his side marked a new chapter in their shared destiny, yet it also highlighted the contrasts between them. While Moses often relied on Zipporah's quiet wisdom, Aaron seemed to draw strength from his boldness, from his ability to speak plainly and take action without hesitation. For Zipporah, the tension between her husband and his brother was not something she fully understood. She loved Moses, but she also knew that he carried a burden too heavy to be shouldered alone. She could see that Aaron's role was vital, but she also feared that the weight of their mission would strain their relationship, testing the limits of brotherly loyalty. Despite these concerns, Zipporah knew that she could only offer her unwavering support. Her role was not to be the loud voice of change, but the steady presence in the background, ensuring that Moses had the strength he needed to face the trials ahead. Her heart was torn between her love for her husband, the tension between him and Aaron, and the uncertainty of the road ahead. Yet, as the days passed and the challenges grew, Zipporah's place in Moses' mission became ever clearer. She was the anchor that held him steady amidst the storm. The first confrontation between Moses, Aaron, and Pharaoh was nothing short of monumental. It was the beginning of a long and arduous battle that would change the course of history. Moses stood before the ruler of Egypt, his heart heavy with the weight of his divine mission, but his words were resolute. "Let my people go," he declared, his voice steady but filled with a deep, unshakable conviction. Pharaoh, sitting atop his throne, looked down on Moses and Aaron with disdain. The request was audacious, even to a ruler who had long considered himself a god. Moses had long known that this moment would be inevitable, but standing before Pharaoh brought the enormity of it all crashing down. The Pharaoh scoffed at the audacity of Moses' demand, his eyes narrowing in anger. He refused. This was no simple request, no ordinary plea. It was a declaration of defiance against the powerful and unyielding empire that had held Israel in bondage for centuries. Pharaoh's anger simmered, and he threatened the Israelites with even harsher conditions. Behind the scenes, Zipporah was a quiet, constant presence, offering Moses the support he desperately needed. She had seen her husband's struggles, his inner conflict, his hesitation, his fears about his mission. She knew how much this moment meant to him, but she also knew that he could not do it alone. As Moses wrestled with the enormity of the task at hand, Zipporah stayed by his side, offering practical help and the emotional strength that he lacked at times. She never spoke much of her feelings about the confrontation with Pharaoh, but her quiet understanding and unwavering support gave Moses the courage he needed to press on. As tensions between Egypt and the Israelites escalated, Zipporah's role became more crucial than ever. She worked to ensure that the day-to-day life of the family was as stable as possible, though even she could not escape the growing storm of unrest. The plagues were a distant threat at this point, but the seeds of the divine judgment were already beginning to sprout. She had lived through the quiet days in Midian, the peace and simplicity that now felt so far removed from the battles her husband faced. Yet, in the midst of it all, she found herself more and more bound to Moses' mission. The fate of the Israelites, the promises of freedom, and the will of God were no longer abstract concepts to her. They were tangible realities, and she knew that she had a part to play, even if it was behind the scenes. The confrontation with Pharaoh was just the beginning of the tumultuous journey that lay ahead. The future was uncertain, fraught with dangers and struggles that no one could have foreseen. But as the tension in Egypt mounted, Zipporah remained steady, a silent pillar in the background, keeping her family together while the world around them threatened to unravel. The days of peace were over, The days of struggle had begun. The plagues began as a series of gradual, yet devastating signs. First came the waters of the Nile, turning to blood, staining the life-giving river with a red that seemed almost unnatural. It was a sign that could not be ignored, a warning that the wrath of God had descended upon Egypt. But Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, unyielding, and unmoved by the suffering of his people. Each plague that followed seemed to intensify the tension in Egypt, as if nature itself had turned against the land. Frogs swarmed the streets, locusts devoured the crops, and darkness enveloped the land for 3 days. The very elements were weapons in a divine war, and Egypt was crumbling beneath them. As the chaos unfolded, Zipporah's concern for Moses grew. She had seen the toll these confrontations had already taken on him, his unwavering determination to free his people, but also the weight of the divine responsibility that pressed down on him like an unrelenting storm. Moses had never wavered in his conviction that he was the chosen one to lead the Israelites to freedom. But Zipporah could not ignore the cost. The man she loved was facing an impossible challenge, and with each passing day, the stakes grew higher. The plagues were no longer distant threats. They were becoming a living nightmare. And Moses, though resolute, was slowly being consumed by the enormity of his mission. In the quiet moments, when they were away from the eyes of others, Zipporah would often find herself wrestling with her own emotions. She knew that Moses' mission was vital, that the fate of their people rested on his shoulders. Yet, she couldn't help but feel a deep, gnawing fear for their family. The plagues were cruel, the people of Egypt suffering in ways Zipporah had never imagined. At times, she questioned if they were on the right path, if this battle was truly the will of God. The quiet life they had once shared in Midian felt like a distant dream, replaced by an endless cycle of hardship and divine judgment. Despite her doubts, Zipporah never let Moses see her inner conflict. She could not afford to. Moses needed her strength, her unwavering support. But as each plague fell upon the land, her heart broke a little more. She could not shake the image of the suffering Egyptians, the helplessness in their eyes, and the growing realization that this was a battle not just between Pharaoh and Moses, but between the powers of heaven and earth. Moses remained determined, his eyes fixed on the freedom of his people. But Zipporah knew that the cost of that freedom was something neither of them had fully understood when they first left Midian. She stood by him, as always, but the weight of the plagues was beginning to bear down on her too. The tension between love for her husband, fear for their family, and empathy for the people of Egypt grew ever more complicated. She knew the journey ahead was long, and the plagues were only the beginning of the trials they would all face. Moses' leadership weighed heavily on him, and Zipporah, though ever supportive, could feel the immense burden he carried. At first, she had admired his resolve, his dedication to a purpose that seemed divinely inspired. But as the days stretched into months, the strain became undeniable. Moses, once a man who shared simple moments of warmth and affection, now seemed distant, consumed by the task that loomed over him like an unshakable cloud. His mind was always on the Israelites, their suffering, their freedom. His heart, once so present with Zipporah and their children, now appeared bound by an invisible chain to the plight of his people. Zipporah knew Moses' role as leader was crucial, yet she struggled to understand the magnitude of his isolation. He had become consumed with his mission, to the point where the boundaries between his personal life and divine responsibility were becoming blurred. The quiet moments they once shared had become rare, replaced by his constant meetings with the elders of Israel, the pressures of speaking before Pharaoh, and the overwhelming task of guiding his people through the desert toward freedom. Zipporah saw the toll it took on him, his once bright eyes now clouded with the weight of responsibility. And in the rare moments when he would return to her, exhausted and emotionally drained, Zipporah felt as though they were drifting further apart. Yet, she understood his sacrifices. Moses was not just her husband. He was a leader chosen by God to liberate an entire nation. This role, however, demanded more than Zipporah had ever anticipated. She had known Moses as the shepherd of Midian, a man at peace with his surroundings, his family, and his faith. But now, he was transformed into a reluctant prophet, a leader struggling to balance his personal life with his divine calling. The man who had once sought peace in the quiet of the desert now found himself in the heart of a spiritual and political battle that would shape the course of history. Zipporah had always been strong, a woman of resilience, but the demands of her marriage were beginning to chip away at her. She had left her family behind, following Moses on this uncertain path, and while her love for him remained unwavering, she often questioned whether her own needs would ever be met again. The sacrifice of being Moses' wife had become a heavy weight she bore quietly, even as she supported him in his mission. She had given up her former life, her ties to her father, and the peaceful existence in Midian, and yet she often felt forgotten in the wake of Moses' calling. The tension between Moses' duties and their marriage was palpable, as if their very connection had become another casualty of the weight Moses carried. Zipporah longed for a sense of intimacy, for the Moses she had once known, the man who had cared for her and their family, the man whose heart had beat in rhythm with hers. But that man seemed lost, replaced by the burden of a leadership that left little room for love, for softness, for their shared humanity. Still, Zipporah stood by him, as she had promised, and though the toll on her was undeniable, she knew her sacrifice was necessary for the fulfillment of the divine plan Moses had been chosen to lead. The night before the final plague weighed heavily on Zipporah. As Moses had instructed, the lamb had been slaughtered, its blood spread on the doorposts, and the bitter herbs prepared. There was an air of quiet tension in the household as the Israelites prepared to observe the first Passover, a ritual that would mark both an end and a new beginning. Zipporah had always been a woman of deep faith, but tonight, her heart was heavy with an unease that went beyond the usual anxiety of the plagues. This was the culmination of everything they had endured. The death of Egypt's firstborn, the plague that would finally break Pharaoh's grip on the Israelites, was upon them, and she felt the weight of it in her bones. As she lit the fire to roast the lamb, Zipporah's thoughts drifted to her children, safe within the walls of their home. It wasn't just Moses' life on the line this time, but all the families of Israel. The blood on the doorposts was a sign of protection, but Zipporah could not shake the dread that lingered in the air. How could any mother find peace knowing that the plague would claim so many innocent lives? Yet, she also knew that this was the moment they had been waiting for, the night of their deliverance. In the quiet of their home, Zipporah moved through her duties with a grace that had come with years of life in the desert, but there was no hiding the sorrow in her heart. She and Moses had shared so much in their journey, but now, in the quiet of the night, she felt the full emotional weight of their mission. The tension between them, the years of hardship, the sacrifices they had made, all of it had led to this moment. Moses' mission was about to be fulfilled, but at what cost? The house was filled with the scent of roasted lamb, and the children, too young to fully understand, sat quietly with their parents, eating the meal that would mark their liberation. Zipporah's eyes occasionally met Moses's, and in them she saw a deep resolve, but also a weariness that had never left him. They both knew that after tonight, nothing would ever be the same. Their lives in Midian, the simple days as shepherds, were gone forever. This was the culmination of Moses' calling, and she, too, had answered it, though in a different way. The night passed slowly, each tick of the clock feeling like an eternity. Zipporah held her children close, praying silently for their safety, for the survival of her family, for the escape that Moses had promised. As the hours stretched on, the weight of history hung heavy in the room. The Israelites were preparing to leave Egypt, but the memory of this night, of the final plague, would be with them forever. And Zipporah, who had walked this road beside Moses from the beginning, felt the significance of the moment more acutely than ever before. The morning light broke over the land, casting long shadows over the scene of hurried departure. The Israelites were leaving Egypt, the land of their bondage, and Zipporah felt a strange blend of exhilaration and sorrow as she watched her people march towards freedom. With Moses by her side, she had followed him through the desert years. But this was different. This was the moment they had been waiting for, and the weight of it all seemed to press down on her chest. The years of slavery, the countless hardships, and the 10 plagues had led to this day. They were finally leaving. But the road ahead would not be easy. As they moved through the narrow streets of the Egyptian city, Zipporah couldn't help but reflect on the miracles she had witnessed: the parting of the Red Sea, the pillar of fire that guided them by night, and the manna that fell from the heavens to sustain them. Moses had always been a man of faith, but now Zipporah saw the full extent of what his calling had led them to. She had seen the hand of God at work, and though her heart was filled with awe, it was also heavy with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The journey would not be easy, and she knew the weight of leadership would continue to fall on Moses' shoulders, with her by his side. For Zipporah, the challenges of being Moses' wife during the Exodus were immense. She was not just the mother of his children, or the woman who had supported him in quiet moments. She was now a witness to the unfolding of a nation's destiny. Her life had been uprooted, and every step forward felt like a step into the unknown. She had grown up in Midian, far from the grand plans of Egypt and Israel. But now, the Exodus was her life too, and there was no turning back. Her thoughts often turned to her children, the ones she had carried through so much already. They had seen their father stand before Pharaoh, defy the gods of Egypt, and lead them out of the land of oppression. Zipporah was proud, but the challenges were not just physical. There was the constant uncertainty, the need for constant faith, and the sacrifices that came with the journey. She was no longer just a shepherd's wife. She was the wife of a leader, of a prophet, and the responsibilities that came with it weighed on her deeply. At night, when the camp was quiet and the sounds of the desert wind whispered across the sands, Zipporah would often find herself alone, gazing at the stars above. In those moments, she wondered if she truly understood what it meant to be a part of Moses' journey. It wasn't just the miracles or the signs. It was the endurance, the commitment, the sacrifice. And in the quiet stillness of those nights, Zipporah knew that her path, though intertwined with Moses's, was uniquely hers to walk. The sea before them stretched vast and still, a wall of water that seemed to pulse with an ancient energy. The cries of the Israelites echoed in the air, filled with both fear and hope. As Moses stood at the water's edge, his staff raised high, Zipporah watched, her heart racing, as the tension in the air thickened. She had seen many signs, many wonders, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. The parting of the Red Sea, the waters parting like curtains drawn by a divine hand. The land before them opened, a dry path appearing as though the sea itself had obeyed Moses' command. Zipporah could hardly breathe as she took in the sight. The sheer power of what she was witnessing felt impossible, unreal. The waters, once so unyielding, now stood tall like towers on either side, creating a path through the heart of the sea. She had heard the words spoken by Moses time and again: God would lead them to freedom. God would protect them, but never before had she felt the weight of those words like she did in this moment. It was as if the heavens themselves were at war, and the earth was trembling beneath her feet. As they began to move forward, Zipporah felt a pull in her chest, a tightness that spoke of uncertainty. The path before them was clear, but her thoughts were clouded. She had seen Pharaoh's army approach from behind, their chariots thundering across the desert sands, the dust rising like smoke. Would the waters close again? Would they be trapped in the middle of the sea? Zipporah glanced at Moses, walking ahead with the determined stride of a man who had been called for such a moment. But she, too, had been called. She was his wife, his partner, and this journey was as much hers as it was his. Yet doubt lingered in the air like the scent of rain before a storm. The Israelites moved swiftly, the children clutching their mother's hands, the elderly helped by those stronger than them. The tension in the air shifted, the uncertainty of the crossing felt by all. They moved forward, step by step, with every passing moment feeling both like a miracle and a terrifying risk. Zipporah's heart beat loudly in her chest, a constant reminder of the fragile nature of their escape. When the Israelites finally made it to the other side, they turned to see the walls of water begin to collapse, the Egyptian army in pursuit. The earth shook with the fury of the waves, and Zipporah gasped, her breath catching in her throat. The waters, once parted, were now a force of destruction, swallowing Pharaoh's chariots and soldiers whole. She watched in awe as the once impossible sight, the waters of the sea, once a barrier, now a weapon, faded into the distance. Victory. They had crossed. They had escaped. But in Zipporah's heart, a heavy weight remained. The future was still uncertain, the journey far from over. She looked at Moses, saw the fire in his eyes. But in her own heart, she grappled with the complex mixture of awe and fear. She knew that their path was not just about physical survival, it was a battle for something much deeper. The wilderness stretched endlessly before them, an expanse of dry land and harsh terrain. Days blurred together, with the scorching sun during the day and the biting cold of the desert at night. The people of Israel were weary, their once hopeful spirits now tested by the relentless conditions of the desert. Zipporah walked beside Moses, her feet sore and her mind heavy with the weight of it all. The desert had never been her home, and yet it seemed to stretch on, unyielding and unforgiving, just like the challenges that Moses faced as their leader. Moses had always been strong in his conviction, steadfast in his belief that God was guiding them. But Zipporah saw the strain in his eyes. His shoulders were heavy with responsibility, burdened by the demands of leadership. Each day brought a new challenge: complaints from the people, a lack of food and water, and the ever-growing tension between the Israelites and the hardships they faced. The miraculous parting of the Red Sea felt distant now, a memory fading against the backdrop of daily struggles. Zipporah could feel Moses' frustration, the quiet moments when he would retreat into himself, wrestling with the enormity of his calling. She had once believed that the wilderness would be a place of freedom, of hope, but now it felt like a never-ending test. The people, too, were restless, their faith beginning to waver. They grumbled about the lack of food, about their suffering in the desert, and Moses bore the weight of their complaints as though they were his own. Zipporah had always known her husband's heart, but she also understood the depths of the challenge he faced as a leader who had to carry the burdens of an entire people. At times, Zipporah felt frustration rise within her, an anger she had never known before. She had supported Moses through every step of their journey, but this life in the wilderness, the endless demands, the mounting frustrations felt more than she could bear. She had always been his partner, his support, but there were moments when she questioned the path they had chosen, the cost of Moses' leadership, and her place in this new world they were trying to create. She loved him, of course, but the weight of the people's burdens, the responsibility of their survival, was becoming too much for her heart to carry alone. In the quiet moments, she would look at Moses and wonder how much longer he could hold on. She wanted to help, to ease his struggle, but there was only so much she could do. The wilderness was changing them both, breaking them down and building them back up in ways they hadn't anticipated. The road ahead was still long, and Zipporah wasn't sure how much longer they could survive this way. She was beginning to understand that survival wasn't just about reaching the promised land. It was about finding a way to endure together. The arrival at Mount Sinai marked the end of the long journey through the wilderness. But for Zipporah, it felt like the beginning of a new kind of solitude. The mountain loomed large before them, its rugged peaks shrouded in mist, casting a shadow over the camp below. The Israelites gathered at its base, but Zipporah could only watch as Moses prepared to ascend. His eyes were set with determination, but Zipporah noticed the quiet weariness that had settled within him. He was to meet with God atop the mountain, to receive the laws that would guide their people. But she could sense that this was a moment that would take him farther from her physically and perhaps even emotionally. As Moses made his way up the steep slopes, Zipporah's heart felt heavy with the weight of his absence. She had always known that his calling was bigger than their marriage, bigger than their family. But now, as he disappeared into the heights, she felt a deeper isolation than ever before. Her role as Moses's wife had always been complicated by the demands of his mission. But now, she felt as though she was being left behind. The people around her were caught up in their own anxieties about the future. But Zipporah found herself in a quiet space, tending to her children, who were still too young to understand the full magnitude of what was unfolding. Her son's cries echoed through the camp, a reminder that while Moses was away, her responsibilities as a mother remained. Days passed with Moses still on the mountain, and Zipporah's sense of isolation grew. She had always been strong, but this time, the silence between her and Moses felt unbearable. She knew that his role was necessary, that his connection with God was the key to their survival. But there were moments when the weight of his absence seemed too much to bear. She missed his presence, the way his voice could calm her worries, the way he would hold her hand at night, reminding her that they were in this together. But now, she was alone with the children, with her doubts, with the ever-present tension between supporting her husband's mission and grappling with the isolation it caused her. With each passing day, Zipporah's connection to the people around her seemed to grow more distant. The women of the camp were preoccupied with their own families, and Zipporah's role had become one of caretaker and observer. She had once been Moses's partner, standing by his side through all their trials, but now she felt as though she was watching from the sidelines. The children needed her, but there was a growing sense that something had shifted within her. She was no longer simply Moses's wife. She was a woman, alone, navigating the space between her love for him and the toll that his calling had taken on her own spirit. As Moses remained on the mountain, Zipporah's mind wandered to the future. What would their life look like after this moment? How would their family survive in a world that was increasingly shaped by Moses's absence? Moses's absence on Mount Sinai stretched far longer than Zipporah had anticipated. What began as a brief departure to receive the law from God turned into days, then weeks, and soon became an eternity. Zipporah could hardly keep track of time as she navigated the daily responsibilities of caring for their children, tending to the camp, and managing the growing unease among the people. The weight of it all seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. The air around her was thick with anxious murmurs. The Israelites, who had once followed Moses's commands without question, now found themselves increasingly restless. They looked to her for guidance, but all Zipporah could offer were quiet reassurances, though she, too, was beginning to feel the fear that clung to the air. Her anxieties were compounded by the silence that had settled in the camp. Without Moses's presence, the balance of power seemed to falter. The people were without leadership, unsure of their next steps. Zipporah knew her husband had been called to a higher purpose, but in his absence, she was left to shoulder the weight of not only their family, but also the collective anxiety of an entire nation. As each day passed, the pressure mounted, and doubts began to creep into her mind. She had never expected to bear the brunt of Moses's mission so fully, but now, as the days stretched into weeks, the challenges of being married to a man with such a divine calling were clearer than ever. Moses's absence also strained her connection to the Israelites. Once, they had all been united by their shared experience of slavery in Egypt, by their hope for freedom, and by the leadership of Moses. Now, Zipporah found herself standing apart, caught between her love for Moses and the struggles of being married to a leader who seemed perpetually distant. The people, once her allies, began to look at her with increasing uncertainty, and she couldn't help but feel the deepening divide. They spoke in hushed voices about Moses's long absence, questioning if he would return at all, and some even began to wonder whether he had truly been chosen by God. It was a struggle Zipporah had never imagined. She had known that Moses's role was crucial, that his relationship with God set him apart from the rest. But the toll it took on her, the loneliness, the fear, the uncertainty had caught her by surprise. As she looked around the camp, she saw the same emotions reflected in the eyes of others. but no one seemed to know how to voice their fears. She tried to stay strong for them, but deep down, she, too, feared what the future might hold. As Moses' absence dragged on, Zipporah's internal conflict only deepened. She had stood beside Moses during his mission to free the Israelites, but now, without him, she was forced to face the stark realities of what it meant to be married to a leader who was constantly absent, not just physically but emotionally as well. The distance between them, once temporary, now felt like an unbridgeable gap. The creation of the golden calf shook the camp to its very core. As the Israelites waited anxiously for Moses' return, their patience wore thin, and their fear turned to doubt. They had followed him through the wilderness, trusting in his leadership and the promises of God. But in the absence of Moses, they grew restless, unable to hold on to the faith that had once carried them through the harshest trials. A sense of chaos spread, and in their desperation, the people turned to idolatry. With Aaron's reluctant consent, they fashioned the golden calf, a physical symbol to replace the invisible God they had followed. They began to worship it, offering sacrifices and celebrating in a frenzy of misguided devotion. Zipporah watched in horror as the people succumbed to this sin. Her heart ached at the sight of the idol, a betrayal of everything Moses had fought for and the very essence of the covenant they had been given. The faith she had once shared with her husband now felt distant, replaced by the noise of the people's misguided beliefs. The Israelites, so recently freed from slavery, were once again ensnared, this time by their own fear and impatience. Her mind raced as she tried to understand how they had fallen so quickly and why her husband was not there to lead them through this trial. Her heart was torn, for though she understood the deep pain Moses would feel upon discovering the idolatry, she, too, could not escape the temptation of doubt that lingered in the air. As Zipporah grappled with her own internal battle, she found herself at a crossroads between her loyalty to Moses and her frustration with the state of the people. The tension between her desire to support her husband and the painful reality of his absence was overwhelming. She questioned how they had arrived at this point, where the people had chosen to worship a golden image instead of waiting in faith. Her role as the wife of a leader felt both burdensome and isolating. With Moses on the mountain, Zipporah was left to witness the fallout, feeling helpless in the face of such a profound mistake. When Moses returned, his face full of anger and sorrow, the consequences of the Israelites' sin became evident. His actions were swift, and his voice thundered with the weight of God's wrath. He destroyed the golden calf and called the people to account for their betrayal. Zipporah stood by, silently observing the confrontation, her heart heavy with the knowledge of how deeply the people had fallen. The moment was a painful reminder of the fine line between faith and despair, between divine patience and judgment. As Moses' anger settled, Zipporah knew this was a turning point, a moment that would change everything for her, for Moses, and for the Israelites. It was clear that the journey ahead would not be easy, and the people's sin would carry its own weight of consequences. Moses' return to the mountain was not just a physical journey, it marked a deep spiritual renewal for both him and the Israelites. After the chaos surrounding the golden calf, the people were shaken, their trust in Moses tested, but God had not abandoned them. The renewal of the covenant was not simply a ritual. It was a chance for the people to reaffirm their relationship with the divine, to rediscover the promises that had once seemed so clear. Moses ascended the mountain once more, this time with a sense of urgency, carrying with him the tablets that would once again embody the law given to Israel. The mountain, once a place of fear and awe, now became a symbol of reconciliation and hope. It was on this mountain that Moses would encounter God again, to receive the second set of tablets, and to begin the process of rebuilding a broken relationship. Zipporah, left behind in the camp with their children, stood in quiet reflection as the reality of the situation settled over her. She had always known Moses' mission was grand and divinely appointed, but she couldn't help but wonder about the future, about their future, and the future of the people of Israel. Her life had been intertwined with Moses's in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. From the moment they met at the well in Midian, their journey together had been marked by a series of challenges, each more demanding than the last. Now, with Moses on the mountain once again, Zipporah was left to navigate the day-to-day struggles of leadership, balancing her role as a wife, mother, and member of a community on the brink of transformation. As she reflected on her life, Zipporah found herself torn. She had seen Moses' unwavering devotion to his people, his tireless efforts to lead them out of Egypt and guide them through the wilderness. Yet, with each passing day, the weight of his calling became more apparent. Moses was no longer just her husband. He was the leader of a nation, the bearer of a covenant that could shape the future of Israel. And in the silence of the camp, Zipporah often felt the sting of her own isolation. It wasn't just the physical distance between them. Moses was often lost in his thoughts, consumed by the task at hand, leaving her to carry the weight of their family's daily needs. She knew the challenges ahead were enormous, but she also understood the importance of her support during these critical moments. When Moses returned, bearing the tablets and the renewed covenant, Zipporah felt both a profound sense of relief and a heavy anticipation for what was to come. She could see in his eyes that the journey ahead would not be easy, but she also saw the deep conviction that had guided him through every trial. In that moment, Zipporah made her own silent promise to stand by her husband, to be the support he needed, even as the people struggled to understand the significance of the covenant being renewed. The road ahead was uncertain, but for Zipporah, it was clear that she would walk it beside Moses, whatever the cost. The weight of leadership continued to bear heavily on Moses, and with it, the growing distance between him and Zipporah. As Moses became increasingly immersed in his responsibilities, judging disputes, guiding the Israelites, and receiving divine instructions, he found himself more consumed by the mission than ever before. The daily struggles of leading a people through the wilderness, the constant demands of his role, and the burden of knowing the immense stakes of his decisions took their toll. Moses' heart, once fully open to Zipporah, now seemed more closed off, distracted by the never-ending needs of his people. Zipporah, ever the quiet strength at his side, felt the shift. She understood, perhaps more than anyone else, the profound weight Moses carried. She had always known that their union would not be easy, that his divine calling would require sacrifices, not just from him, but from her as well. Yet, the growing emotional distance between them was difficult to ignore. Moses, the man she loved, had become more of a distant figure than the husband she had once known. The long hours spent away from their family, the constant counsel with his brother Aaron, and the seemingly endless debates with the Israelites left little room for intimacy or even simple conversation. Her role as Moses' wife had transformed from that of a partner to that of a supporter, an unwavering presence in the background. She was the one who tended to their children, kept the household in order, and dealt with the occasional tensions of their people. She was the quiet one in the camp, holding everything together when Moses was lost in the task of leadership. Her love for him had never wavered, but there were moments when she questioned if the sacrifices were too great, even for someone who had been chosen for such a grand purpose. Still, Zipporah did not voice her frustrations aloud. She understood the magnitude of Moses' mission, the importance of what he was doing, and the divine calling that guided him. There were sacrifices she had to make, sacrifices that were both personal and familial. She had given up the simplicity of life in Midian, the peace she once knew, to follow Moses into the unknown. But she knew that her sacrifices were necessary both for the good of her family and for the people Moses led. She had seen the miracles and the signs, witnessed the hand of God in their journey. She knew that this mission was not just for the Israelites, but for something far greater. Despite the growing distance, Zipporah's strength remained constant. It was in the quiet moments, when she was alone with their children, that she found her resolve. She prayed, not just for Moses' strength, but for the strength to continue supporting him, even when it seemed as though the world was pulling them further apart. In her heart, she held a quiet hope that the man she had married, the man of faith and conviction, would one day find his way back to her. Until then, she would walk beside him in silence, holding the weight of his mission as best as she could. Being married to Moses, the leader chosen by God, was both a profound honor and an immense challenge for Zipporah. She had once lived a quiet life in Midian, surrounded by her family, but now, her existence seemed tethered to the monumental task of supporting a leader destined to shape the future of a nation. As the wife of Moses, she was often forgotten in the shadow of his extraordinary mission, her role seemingly secondary to the mighty work he was carrying out. Zipporah's struggles were not just the challenges of being a wife to a prophet, but also the complexities of being a woman in a male-dominated world. In a society where men held power and made decisions, Zipporah's voice was rarely heard. Her own identity, once defined by her heritage and family, now seemed to dissolve in the wake of Moses' divine calling. She was seen first and foremost as Moses' wife, and nothing more. In the bustling camp, while Moses spoke with authority, interpreting God's will, Zipporah quietly cared for their children, tended to the needs of the people, and supported her husband in ways that went largely unnoticed by the wider community. It was not that she resented Moses' calling or the mission that was unfolding before them. She loved him deeply and understood the magnitude of what he was doing. But in her heart, she felt an ever-growing sense of isolation, a feeling that her own struggles and sacrifices were invisible to those around her. The work of caring for their family, supporting Moses, and maintaining the balance of their lives seemed to slip by in the shadows of Moses' leadership. As the Israelites flourished under Moses' guidance, she was left to quietly hold the family together, always in the background, never stepping forward. There were times when Zipporah couldn't help but feel overlooked, her own emotions and desires placed on hold in favor of the divine plan Moses was serving. She often found herself questioning the cost of her own existence in this greater story. While Moses' role was public and powerful, Zipporah's role was personal and quiet, and in the overwhelming presence of Moses' mission, it was easy to feel forgotten. Her sacrifices, her loneliness, the struggles she faced in their marriage, they were unseen by most, ignored by many, and perhaps even by Moses himself. But Zipporah had always been strong. In a world that allowed little room for women to thrive in the way men did, she found ways to survive, even if only in the margins. She didn't complain or seek attention. Her strength came from within, from a deep love for Moses and a fierce devotion to the mission they were part of. Even when she felt invisible, she understood that her role, though quiet, was critical. Without her unwavering support, Moses' journey would have been infinitely harder. But still, the challenges of being a woman in such a world, her world remained. The rebellion of Korah struck a deep chord within the camp of Israel, shaking the very foundation of Moses' leadership. As accusations of power-hungry intentions swirled, Zipporah watched the once unified people of God turn on each other. What had begun as a journey of hope and divine purpose was now marked by discord and disobedience. Korah, along with his followers, openly challenged Moses' authority, questioning the very legitimacy of his role as God's chosen leader. Zipporah could feel the tension hanging in the air like a storm cloud, threatening to burst at any moment. For Zipporah, the sight of the growing unrest was a painful reminder of the difficulties of Moses' position. He had led the people through trials, plagues, and miracles. But now, faced with open defiance, the cracks in the community's faith were starting to show. The Israelites were no longer a united people, but a fractured group torn apart by envy, pride, and ambition. It was a sharp contrast to the fervor of their early days, when the Exodus was still fresh, and they believed wholeheartedly in the promise of a new land. Now, doubts and rebellion festered among them, and Zipporah felt the weight of this division in her bones. Moses, ever steadfast, had no choice but to confront the rebellion head-on. But as he did, Zipporah could not help but notice the toll it was taking on him. The burden of leadership seemed to grow heavier with every passing day. As Moses faced the challenge of quelling Korah's uprising, Zipporah, in the quiet moments away from the camp, felt a pang of isolation. She understood the spiritual depth of what Moses was doing, but the emotional cost of supporting him was becoming more evident. Moses was no longer just a husband, but a man constantly embroiled in the demands of his calling. The woman he had once shared dreams with now found herself navigating her own path through the wilderness of uncertainty and sacrifice. As the confrontation with Korah escalated, Zipporah watched from the sidelines, her thoughts drifting between concern for Moses' well-being and a deepening sense of frustration. It was becoming clearer that no matter how hard she tried to support him, Moses would never be able to share the full weight of his struggles with her. He was a leader, chosen by God, and that calling had placed him in a position where his personal life was always secondary to the mission. In those moments, Zipporah questioned her own place in all of this. The rebellion of Korah wasn't just a challenge to Moses' leadership, it was a reminder of the delicate balance they were trying to maintain, not just as a husband and wife, but as a family caught in the crossfire of divine purpose. The strain of it all pulled them in different directions, and Zipporah wondered, for the first time, how much longer she could endure this life of quiet sacrifice, watching as Moses carried the weight of a nation's hopes and its doubts. The news of Miriam's death came as a heavy blow to Moses, a loss that reverberated through the entire camp. Zipporah, despite the distance that had grown between them over the years, felt the weight of the grief settle over her husband like a shroud. Miriam had been Moses' sister, his confidant, and his partner in the journey that had started so long ago. Zipporah knew that no matter how many battles Moses had fought, or how many challenges he had overcome, this loss would be different. Miriam was not just a family member. She had been a part of the foundation of Moses' leadership. Her death would mark a profound change in Moses' world. Zipporah watched as Moses withdrew into himself, his normally composed exterior cracking in the face of sorrow. The man who had led millions through the wilderness now seemed lost, overwhelmed by the grief of losing his sister. Zipporah had always been a quiet support for Moses, her role often defined by the demands of his mission rather than the emotional needs of their marriage. But now, as Moses struggled to find his footing, she knew that her role would shift once again. She would have to be more than just a partner in the journey. She would have to be his anchor in this storm of grief. In the days that followed, Zipporah tried her best to console Moses, though she knew there was little she could say that would ease the pain of his loss. She tried to take on more responsibilities, allowing him the space he needed to mourn, while also managing the constant demands of the Israelites. The people who had once followed Moses in unity now seemed more fractured than ever, and Zipporah knew that the burden of leadership would continue to press heavily on Moses, even as he carried the sorrow of Miriam's death. The loss of his sister, combined with the ever-present weight of his leadership, was starting to take its toll on their marriage. She saw the emotional distance growing between them, a distance that she feared might never fully be bridged. The pain of Miriam's passing lingered, and Zipporah knew that it was not just the loss of a sister that Moses was mourning, but the relentless cost of leadership that had stripped him of the opportunity to truly grieve. Moses, ever the leader, couldn't afford to show weakness. His grief was something he would have to carry silently, as always, for the sake of his people. And yet, in the quiet moments between them, Zipporah could sense the cracks in his spirit, the toll that years of constant leadership, loss, and sacrifice had taken on him. As the days passed, Zipporah's heart ached for her husband, knowing that the pain he carried was a burden that she could not fully share. And yet, she stayed by his side, a quiet presence, offering the support she knew he needed but never asked for. In this time of loss, Zipporah's strength became the one thing that Moses could lean on, even if he could never fully reveal the depth of his sorrow. Zipporah watched Moses from a distance, his figure always at the front of the camp, a leader burdened with the weight of 1,000,000 souls. The demands of the Israelites were endless, their voices rising in unison as they pleaded for food, water, and reassurance. Every day Moses stood before them, unwavering in his resolve to guide them through the wilderness. But Zipporah knew the toll it was taking on him. and, in turn, on their family. The Exodus, once a divine promise of freedom, had become a relentless struggle for survival. The journey, which had begun with such hope, now felt like an unending trial. Zipporah, once a quiet presence in Moses' life, now found herself questioning the price of leadership. She understood the sacred responsibility he carried. But as the years wore on, she began to see the toll it took on their relationship. Moses was always consumed by the people's needs, by the constant barrage of requests for guidance, for miracles, for answers. She, too, had her own needs, her own struggles. But Moses, her husband, the man she had followed across the desert, seemed so far removed from her now. His heart, his attention, was with the people, and she was left to carry the weight of their family alone. Her thoughts often drifted to their children and to the future they would inherit. What would it be like for them to grow up in this constant state of struggle, in the shadow of their father's leadership? How long could they live this way, moving from one crisis to the next, never finding peace, never settling into a life of stability? Zipporah wondered, in the quiet moments of reflection, what her children would say when they looked back on this time. Would they remember their father's strength, his unwavering commitment to his people? Or would they, like her, remember the sacrifices, the loneliness, the ever-present weight of leadership that had taken their father from them? Maintaining personal relationships amidst this national struggle had become an impossible task. Moses' role as a leader consumed him. He was always called away, always absorbed in the affairs of the people. Zipporah, too, found herself constantly pulled in different directions, caring for the children, managing the daily needs of the camp, supporting Moses in whatever way she could. But in the silence of the night, when the camp had settled and the fires flickered low, Zipporah felt the distance between them grow. The bond they once shared, forged through the trials of the past, had become frayed. The Exodus, which had once promised freedom, had now become a chain, binding them both to something greater than themselves. Zipporah understood that Moses' leadership was essential to their survival, but it did not make the loneliness easier to bear. As the years passed, she saw the personal cost of this divine mission, the unraveling of her own happiness, the fading of her connection to Moses, and the burden of a life spent in service to something far larger than themselves. The struggle, it seemed, was endless. The journey toward the promised land had become a relentless march through an unforgiving wilderness. Each day felt like the last, with the Israelites pushing forward, hoping for relief, for a sign that they were drawing closer to the land of milk and honey. But Zipporah saw the weariness in Moses' eyes, the deep lines of exhaustion etched into his face. His once steady hand had begun to tremble under the weight of the decisions he had to make. It was not just the demands of the people, but the constant struggle against doubt, against the relentless pressure of leading a nation in a place that had no mercy. Zipporah's heart ached for Moses. She could see the heavy toll it had taken on him. The promises of freedom, of a new life, had not come to pass the way they had envisioned. Instead of peace, there was only chaos, frustration, and anger. The people, once full of hope, were beginning to grumble again, and with every complaint, Moses' burden grew heavier. Zipporah had known the trials of leadership before, but this was different. She had seen the miracle of their liberation, the power of the plagues, the parting of the Red Sea. But now, all of that seemed distant, a fading memory of a time when God's hand had so clearly guided them. Now, the path forward was shrouded in doubt and struggle. Her frustrations were not born of anger at Moses, but from a deep sense of helplessness. She, too, had sacrificed so much: her peace, her family's stability, her personal desires. But with each passing day, her patience was wearing thin. She had followed Moses into the wilderness, standing by him in every trial. But now the weight of their journey felt unbearable. She questioned the choices that had led them here, the years spent wandering with no clear end in sight. Moses, ever the leader, remained steadfast in his commitment. But Zipporah wondered how much longer he could endure. How much longer could they both live this life of uncertainty and struggle? Their children grew older, and Zipporah could see the toll the journey was taking on them, too. She wanted so desperately to offer them a sense of home, of belonging, but all they had known was wandering, displacement, and the uncertainty of their future. As she watched Moses lead, rallying the people, guiding them toward a destination that always seemed just out of reach, she could not help but feel a growing sadness. They had sacrificed so much, and yet the promised land felt further away than ever. Moses's dream, his vision, had become their shared reality, and while she stood by him, Zipporah wondered if it would ever be enough, if the land they sought would truly heal the wounds they had suffered. Would it be worth all they had lost along the way? Or was it merely another place, another trial they would have to endure? In the end, Zipporah's struggle mirrored Moses's, both of them giving everything for the sake of a future that seemed ever distant. Their love, their marriage, had become something they had to hold on to with all their strength. For the sake of the nation, they pressed on, but neither could shake the weight of the cost. The news of Aaron's death reached Zipporah like a blow to the chest. She had always known that Moses's journey would be fraught with sacrifice, but this loss cut deeper than she had ever expected. Aaron, his brother, his closest confidant, had stood by him through all the trials, and now, in the wilderness, they were left to face the future without him. Zipporah watched as Moses, always a figure of strength, seemed to crumble under the weight of his grief. The loss was not just personal, it was political. Aaron had been more than a brother to Moses. He had been his spokesperson, his companion in leading the Israelites. With his death, there was a sharp sense of uncertainty, a void that could not be easily filled. Moses had always been the one to shoulder the burden of leadership, but now he faced the responsibility of leading without the support of his brother. Zipporah knew her husband well enough to understand the storm of emotions that churned inside him. His role as a leader had often left him feeling isolated, but Aaron's death cast a long shadow over him. It was as if the very foundation of their mission was shaking beneath them. For Zipporah, the loss of Aaron meant something deeper. She had always been a quiet supporter of Moses's mission, standing by his side when others doubted, even when she too had her moments of doubt. But now, she felt the strain of it all. She had borne witness to the hardships, the sacrifices, and the toll of their journey, but she had never imagined this moment. She saw the grief in Moses's eyes, the weariness in his posture, and she knew that the journey ahead was becoming more impossible with every passing day. She worried about the future of leadership within Israel. Who would take Aaron's place? Who would Moses turn to now? The Israelites were already a restless people, divided by fear and frustration, and Zipporah couldn't help but wonder if this loss would deepen the cracks within their community. The weight of leadership had always been Moses's, but now it seemed even heavier. As Moses struggled to reconcile his grief with his responsibilities, Zipporah found herself walking the delicate line of being his wife and his unwavering supporter. She knew he would press on, that he would lead as best he could, but she also knew that something was broken now, something that could never be fully mended. She couldn't help but feel the uncertainty hanging over them, the fear of what might come next. The road to the promised land had never seemed more distant. With Aaron's death, Zipporah realized that their journey was no longer just one of physical distance, but one of emotional survival. The future was uncertain, and the burden of leadership had shifted once more, leaving both Moses and her questioning what it would mean for their family, their people, and the path that lay ahead. As Moses aged, the weight of his years began to show in his every movement. The once strong leader, who had defied Pharaoh and led a nation through wilderness and despair, now seemed fragile, a shadow of the man he once was. The journey that had taken so much from him was drawing to a close, and Zipporah watched him with a mixture of pride and sorrow. His every sigh spoke of the burdens he had borne for so long, and now, in the final days, there was a quiet resignation in his eyes. It was a realization that had come slowly to him, but it had finally settled. He would not enter the promised land. Zipporah, ever the steadfast partner, had known the pain of his journey better than most. She had stood beside him, witnessed his struggles, and weathered the storms of leadership by his side. But now, as Moses approached the end of his earthly mission, the weight on her own heart seemed almost as heavy. She saw the quiet battles within him as he prepared to pass on the mantle of leadership to Joshua, a man who had proven his worth, yet could never replace the man Moses had been. For Zipporah, it was a time of reflection. Their journey, their sacrifices, had led them here, to this moment of quiet acceptance. In his final days, Moses spoke little of the pain he felt. His words, as always, were about the people, about the Israelites who had followed him, the people he had led through hardships. It was never about his own personal loss, but Zipporah could see it in the way his hands trembled as he held the scrolls, as he prepared the words for the future. She knew, deep in her heart, that this was not just the passing of a leader, but of the last part of Moses that had lived for something greater than himself. His body was weary, but his spirit remained bound to the promise of God's covenant with Israel. Zipporah's role in these final moments was quiet but unyielding. She was there to hold him up when his strength faltered, to offer solace in the moments when words failed him. Her love for Moses was as steadfast as it had been in their early days in Midian, but now it was colored with the profound knowledge that the end of one journey meant the beginning of another for their children and the nation. She had seen the toll the years had taken on him, the isolation that came with the weight of leadership. And now, as Moses passed his final instructions, Zipporah stood by his side as both his wife and the silent witness to a chapter that was closing. As Moses prepared to leave this world, Zipporah found herself overwhelmed by the emotions of it all, the sorrow for the end, the gratitude for the life they had shared, and the uncertain future that lay ahead. She had never imagined this would be the way it ended, watching Moses' final days unfold, not in triumph, but in quiet acceptance. And in her heart, she understood that Moses had finally come to terms with what was to come, but she, too, would carry the weight of their journey alone from here on out. Moses' death came quietly, as the land that had borne witness to his greatest triumphs and deepest struggles fell into a mournful silence. He had led the Israelites with unwavering faith and courage, guiding them through the wilderness and toward the promised land. But now, after years of devotion, he was gone. Zipporah, standing at the threshold of their shared journey, felt the weight of this moment like a stone sinking in her chest. The man who had once stood as a towering figure of strength was now a memory, and the loss was more profound than she had ever imagined. Her mourning was not just for the husband she had shared so much with, but for the man who had been so burdened by his role as a leader. She had seen the toll it had taken on him, the sleepless nights, the doubt, and the endless sacrifices. And now, with his passing, a part of her seemed to wither in the same way. Yet, there was no time to linger in her grief. The Israelites, those she had come to know as her own people, still needed guidance. They had witnessed Moses' strength and his failures, but now it was time for them to look to Joshua, the one who would continue the work that Moses had started. The transition of leadership was not an easy one, and Zipporah, despite her personal loss, could not ignore the call of the future. As Moses had chosen Joshua to succeed him, so too would Zipporah have to accept that her role as the wife of the leader would shift. Joshua, a man of courage and faith, now stood at the helm, ready to guide the people into the land they had longed for. There was an unspoken understanding between them, one rooted in their shared history and the sacrifices they had all made. As Moses' death echoed through the camp, Zipporah reflected on the legacy he left behind. His was not a legacy of perfection, but of perseverance, of a man who had wrestled with God, with doubt, and with the weight of an entire people's future. She had witnessed Moses' inner battles, the moments when he had wanted to give up, and yet he had never faltered in his calling. His legacy was not just in the laws he had passed down or the miracles he had performed, but in the people he had brought together and the hope he had instilled in them. In the quiet of those final moments, Zipporah understood that Moses' work was far from over. His influence would live on in the hearts of the Israelites and in the leadership of Joshua. But for Zipporah, the most profound legacy Moses had left was the unwavering love and commitment to his people and his family. It was a legacy she would carry with her, alone now, as the dust settled on the life of the man she had loved and followed. After Moses' death, Zipporah found herself standing on the precipice of a life that was once unimaginable to her. The man who had been her companion, her partner, and the focal point of her world was gone, and with him, the life they had shared. The wilderness, once a place of daily struggle and faith, now seemed colder, more vast, and quieter. Moses had been the leader, the prophet, the one who stood at the intersection of the divine and the earthly. Now, it was time for Zipporah to navigate a new existence, one without the man who had carried the weight of a nation on his shoulders, and so much of that weight had unknowingly been shared by her as well. As a widow, Zipporah faced a world where her place was now uncertain. Her role as the wife of Moses had defined her life for so long, yet now that position no longer existed in the same way. The Israelites, the people she had come to love and serve alongside her husband, needed guidance, but they were no longer looking to her as they once did. Joshua was the leader now, and though Zipporah respected him, she also understood that her path would no longer intertwine with the decisions of the nation in the same way. But her bond with her people, her love for them, would never waver. In the years that followed, Zipporah's role shifted in ways both small and significant. She no longer stood beside Moses, witnessing the miracles and struggles firsthand, but she became a quiet pillar of support for the new leadership. Her wisdom, forged over years of living in the shadows of Moses' greatness, became a guiding presence in the community, even if only behind the scenes. She did not seek recognition or a formal position of power, but she remained a steady voice of reason and experience, especially in moments when the Israelites faced challenges that echoed the trials they had endured during the Exodus. Zipporah's life was marked by sacrifice just as it had been during Moses' leadership. Yet now, her sacrifices were less about the demands of the people and more about the internal, quieter acts of mourning and survival. As a widow, she found strength in the quiet moments of reflection, in her memories of Moses and their shared journey. But there were moments, too, when the grief would resurface, reminding her of what she had lost, not just a husband, but a life that had been defined by the extraordinary. In time, Zipporah's legacy became something of a quiet reflection, often overlooked but undeniably significant. She was the wife of Moses, but she was also a woman who had lived through the peaks and valleys of an extraordinary story. Her legacy was one of resilience, of standing steadfast in the face of uncertainty, and of being a silent support to the man who led the Israelites to freedom. Though Moses' name would echo through history, Zipporah's was carved into the fabric of that legacy as the woman who, through every trial and sacrifice, helped make it possible. Zipporah's legacy in Israel's history is one that runs quietly beneath the surface of its grand narrative, but its influence is profound nonetheless. As the first wife of Moses, she was part of the very foundation of the nation's story. While Moses led Israel out of Egypt and shaped its spiritual path, Zipporah played a crucial, though often overlooked, role in the forming of the nation's identity. She was not only a wife, but also a mother who witnessed the miracles of the Exodus and the early struggles of the Israelites in the wilderness. She was there, bearing witness to the formation of a people who would become a beacon for others, grounded in their faith and their unique history with God. Zipporah's role, however, wasn't just in supporting Moses from behind the scenes. Her presence, though quieter than his, still carved a place in the cultural memory of Israel. As a Midianite woman, she brought a perspective to the Israelite experience that was grounded in the broader world outside Egypt and Sinai. She was an outsider who became an insider, and in doing so, she brought a rich cultural and spiritual dimension to Israel's early years. Her story, though not as widely remembered or celebrated as Moses's, became a subtle thread in the weaving of Israel's story, one that spoke to the diversity of God's people, to the blending of different traditions under the covenant with the Almighty. Her place in Israel's history is also defined by her motherhood. Zipporah's children, though not as prominently featured in the biblical account as other figures, were part of the next generation of Israelites. Through them, Zipporah's influence continued. As Moses's children grew up, their mother's role in their lives would have shaped their understanding of leadership, of faith, and of identity. Moses's sons, though not as widely recognized as the leaders they might have been, carried within them the legacy of both their father's divine mission and their mother's quiet strength. Zipporah, though largely absent from the great moments of Israel's later history, had a profound influence on the formation of Israel's values. Her life shaped the hearts of her children, and in them, her legacy lived on. Though Moses's leadership became the defining story of the Exodus, Zipporah's was a quiet one, marked by resilience, faith, and love, a woman who stood steadfast in the shadows of a great leader, but whose impact would never be forgotten. Her presence in Israel's early history laid the groundwork for the nation's identity, one that blended faith, resilience, and the enduring strength of women like her. Zipporah's Midianite heritage subtly but powerfully influenced both Moses's leadership and the broader development of Israel. As a Midianite, her background provided a unique perspective on the world, one that differed greatly from the Egyptian worldview that Israel had known. The Midianites, a group descended from Abraham through his second wife Keturah, were closely linked to the nomadic desert tribes, people accustomed to survival in harsh environments, and to a form of worship grounded in the natural world. This perspective shaped Zipporah's outlook and her relationship with Moses, as she brought elements of her people's wisdom into the very heart of Israel's spiritual life. Her Midianite heritage was, in many ways, a bridge between the people of Israel and the broader world around them. It gave Moses an understanding of different cultures, one that influenced his interactions with other nations, especially during the early years of the Exodus. Zipporah, as the wife of Moses, played an essential role in maintaining his connection to this outside world. She had seen the ways in which different peoples lived, their practices, and their belief systems. This made her a quiet counselor to Moses, offering him a broader lens through which to view the unfolding events. It was not just her role as a wife, but as a woman from a different background that gave her voice within their marriage, ensuring that the decisions Moses made were not solely influenced by his Israelite heritage, but also by a broader, more inclusive worldview. Zipporah's background also influenced Israel's relationships with other nations. The Israelites, under Moses's leadership, would need to navigate the complex web of alliances, treaties, and interactions with surrounding peoples. Zipporah's understanding of tribal dynamics, her experiences with the Midianites, allowed Moses to approach these relationships with a greater sense of diplomacy. Though Israel was a people chosen by God, they were not isolated in a vacuum. Their interactions with the surrounding nations would play a crucial role in their survival and development. Zipporah's presence reminded Moses that the Israelites were part of a wider tapestry of human experience, one that included both conflict and cooperation. Zipporah's legacy, though not often spoken of in grand terms, left an indelible mark on Israel's cultural and spiritual journey. As the mother of Moses's children and as a woman of Midianite descent, her role was foundational to the spiritual identity of Israel. She was not just a passive figure in the story of the Exodus, but an active participant whose wisdom, drawn from her heritage, contributed to the shaping of a nation. Through Zipporah, Moses was reminded of the importance of diversity, of learning from the world around them, and of building relationships that were not solely dictated by power but by mutual understanding and respect. Her Midianite heritage shaped the early years of Israel's existence and left an enduring imprint on their journey into the Promised Land. Zipporah's legacy was carried forward through her children, who, though not as prominently featured in the annals of Israel's history as their father Moses, played a vital role in the unfolding narrative of the nation. Her sons, Gershom and Eleazar, were born during the years of Moses' exile in Midian, their births marking the continuation of her line and the inheritance of her values. Gershom, whose name meant a stranger there, reflected the deep connection Zipporah had to the themes of identity and belonging, particularly within the broader context of Israel's relationship to the nations. Eleazar, named for the God of Moses' father, carried with him a reminder of Zipporah's faith and the importance of divine protection. As Israel journeyed through the wilderness and into the Promised Land, Zipporah's children carried the weight of both her teachings and their father's leadership. They were not merely Moses' sons, but also the bearers of the knowledge and wisdom Zipporah had imparted to them in the quiet moments of their lives. Her influence was subtle yet powerful, as she molded them to understand both the responsibilities of leadership and the importance of compassion. She taught them that leadership was not solely about command, but about listening, learning, and understanding those they led. This lesson, which Zipporah herself had learned during her marriage to Moses, would be passed down through her sons, woven into the fabric of their lives and their roles within the community. Zipporah's maternal teachings shaped the moral and spiritual compass of her children. Her influence on their lives was profound, even if it didn't always make its way into the official narrative of Israel's leaders. She taught them to navigate the complexities of identity, how to reconcile their Midianite heritage with their role as part of the chosen people of God. Her teachings instilled in them a deep sense of justice, respect for life, and the importance of wisdom in leadership. These lessons, passed on quietly yet steadfastly through her daily actions, became the foundation of their characters. The lasting influence of Zipporah's maternal guidance can be seen in the way her sons carried themselves in Israel's leadership structure. While Gershom and Eleazar may not have had the spotlight that Moses did, they were integral parts of the community's growth and stability. Eleazar, in particular, would later become a key figure in the priesthood, his role further embedding Zipporah's legacy into the religious life of Israel. In this way, Zipporah's impact endured long after her time with Moses had passed. Zipporah's legacy was not one of grandiose acts or public acclaim. Instead, it was embedded in the quiet strength of her maternal influence, passed down through the lives of her children. In them, her teachings of faith, leadership, and justice endured, woven into the spiritual and cultural tapestry of Israel for generations to come. Zipporah, though often a silent figure in the biblical narrative, occupies an important, though sometimes understated, place in Jewish tradition. Her presence in the story of Moses is profound, and as the first wife of the great leader, she plays a significant role in shaping not only his life, but the larger trajectory of Israel's history. While the Torah focuses largely on Moses' mission, Zipporah's actions and her quiet strength carry theological and symbolic weight in Jewish thought. She is not just the wife of Moses, but a bridge between two worlds, the Midianite heritage that she brought into her marriage, and the divine calling that Moses was destined to fulfill. Jewish tradition, in its deep examination of biblical characters, highlights the complexities within Zipporah's character. Though Moses' life is filled with grandeur and divine encounters, Zipporah's role is that of the steady, grounded presence, dealing with the practical and often difficult aspects of life. Her quiet intervention when Moses was nearly killed by God during the incident at the inn, where she circumcised their son, demonstrates her bravery and ability to act decisively in moments of divine urgency. This act is seen by some scholars as symbolic of Zipporah's deeper understanding of God's requirements, even when they seem alien or incomprehensible. Her quick thinking in that moment not only saved Moses' life, but underscored the importance of covenantal obedience, a theme central to the Jewish faith. The theological implications of Zipporah's character are rich and varied. As a Midianite woman, she is not an Israelite by birth, yet she becomes an integral part of the story of Israel's redemption. Her inclusion in the narrative speaks to the idea of the expansion of God's covenant beyond the boundaries of Israel. In Zipporah, the Jewish tradition finds a symbol of inclusion, as she, a woman from a foreign land, marries into the chosen people, carrying forward the promise of God's love to all nations. Some scholars view her as a representative of the Gentile nations that will eventually come to recognize God, a foreshadowing of the inclusion of non-Israelites into the broader community of believers. Zipporah is remembered in later Jewish texts not as a central figure in the historical unfolding of Israel's story, but as an important background character whose actions reverberate throughout the biblical narrative. Jewish commentary on Zipporah, though not as abundant as those on other figures, acknowledges her quiet yet vital presence. In rabbinic literature, her role in Moses' life is often discussed in terms of marital support and faithfulness. She is also considered a figure of strength and resilience, one who must navigate the difficult circumstances of being married to a prophet and leader tasked with liberating an entire nation. Though she did not live to see the full fruition of Moses' leadership, Zipporah's legacy endures. Jewish thought continues to reflect on her role as a wife, mother, and outsider who found a place within the sacred history of Israel. Her actions, while seemingly small, underscore the larger themes of loyalty, faith, and obedience that are woven throughout Jewish tradition. In a faith that emphasizes the power of stories and their deep meanings, Zipporah remains a quietly profound figure, her impact felt in the unspoken spaces of biblical narrative. Zipporah's role in Christian theology, while often overshadowed by the more prominent figures of Moses and the Israelites, holds unique theological significance. As Moses' wife, she becomes an integral part of the broader narrative of redemption and God's covenantal relationship with his people. In the Christian context, Zipporah's presence and actions can be interpreted as emblematic of several theological themes, including obedience, faith, and the universality of God's plan. Her marriage to Moses bridges the divide between God's chosen people, Israel, and the Gentile nations, which is an important concept in Christian theology, especially as it relates to the inclusion of all people in the salvation story. In the New Testament, the theme of inclusion, whether of Gentiles or outcasts, is vital. Zipporah, as a Midianite woman, represents the Gentile world, and her role in Moses' story anticipates the opening of God's covenant to non-Israelites, a theme that is later emphasized in the teachings of Jesus Christ. Just as Jesus reached beyond the borders of Israel to extend grace and salvation to all nations, Zipporah's marriage to Moses foreshadows the broader scope of God's redemption. This inclusion of a non-Israelite into the sacred narrative reflects the Christian understanding of God's love being all-encompassing, preparing the way for the eventual fulfillment of salvation through Christ. Zipporah's life and marriage to Moses also provide a rich theological lesson in obedience. Her decisive actions during the incident at the inn, where she circumcised their son in obedience to God's covenant, demonstrate her awareness of the importance of God's commands, even in the face of uncertainty. In Christian thought, her swift action is a reflection of the obedience required from all believers. This event is also a powerful reminder that faithfulness to God's will often requires courage and sacrifice. Zipporah's willingness to take action on her own, in a moment of crisis, speaks to the themes of personal responsibility and the necessity of responding to God's call, even when it is difficult to understand or uncomfortable to follow. In Christian theology, Zipporah can be seen as a symbol of the Church's relationship with Christ. Just as Moses was called to deliver God's people, so too is the Church called to spread the message of salvation. The union of Moses and Zipporah can be viewed as a representation of the covenant between Christ and the Church, one that is based on love, sacrifice, and obedience to God's plan. Just as Moses' mission was central to the salvation of the Israelites, so too is the mission of Christ central to the salvation of humanity. Through Zipporah's quiet strength, her sacrificial acts, and her role as the wife of the one who would lead God's people out of Egypt, Christian theology finds a rich narrative of faith, obedience, and divine purpose. Her story, while brief, echoes through the corridors of Christian thought, reminding believers that God's purposes often include the unexpected and the overlooked, and that His love and salvation extend beyond boundaries, reaching all who are willing to obey and follow His call. In Islamic tradition, Zipporah, known as Safura or Safura, plays a significant yet subtle role within the broader narrative of Prophet Moses, Musa, and his mission. Though her name is not explicitly mentioned in the Quran, Islamic teachings acknowledge her as Moses' wife and recognize her role in supporting him during his prophetic journey. In many respects, Islamic perspectives on Zipporah parallel those found in the Judeo-Christian traditions, with a few distinct differences in emphasis. Islamic sources, such as the Quran and Hadith literature, focus on Moses' mission to deliver God's message to Pharaoh and the Israelites. Though the Quran doesn't provide an extensive recounting of Zipporah's story, her support of Moses during his struggle with Pharaoh is implied. Islamic narratives highlight the human and familial aspects of Moses' life, underscoring his personal struggles and the significance of his relationships. While the Quran does not offer specific details about Zipporah's actions, her role as a wife and mother within the household is integral to the larger narrative of faith and perseverance. The most notable incident in Islamic tradition that involves Zipporah is the episode where she assists Moses during his time of need. The Quran speaks of Moses fleeing Egypt after having killed an Egyptian and finding refuge in the land of Midian. Here, Zipporah and her family are introduced as the ones who provide Moses with hospitality. This moment echoes the biblical narrative in which Zipporah is depicted as the one who circumcises their son to avert divine wrath. Though the Quran does not detail this act, the importance of Moses' mission and the role of his family in supporting it is consistent across traditions. In Islamic teachings, there is a shared focus on obedience to God's commands, and this is reflected in how Zipporah's role can be understood. Just as her support for Moses is a reflection of faithfulness, in the Islamic view, the relationship between husband and wife, as exemplified by Moses and Zipporah, reflects the broader theme of mutual support in the pursuit of God's will. Zipporah's role thus serves as an example of how spouses are partners in the service of God, and the dedication to supporting one another in the fulfillment of divine purpose. One significant difference in the Islamic view of Zipporah is the emphasis placed on the collective history of prophets and their families. Islam views all prophets as part of a greater narrative that spans across time and nations, with each prophet's family playing a crucial role in the fulfillment of God's plan. Zipporah's role is not isolated to Moses' story alone, but part of the broader context of God's guidance for humanity. Islamic traditions underscore the importance of the family unit in supporting prophetic missions, and Zipporah's contributions to Moses' understanding of God's commands and his leadership are seen within this light. In the end, while Zipporah is not as central a figure in Islamic tradition as she is in Judeo-Christian texts, her quiet strength and role as the supportive wife of one of the greatest prophets in Islam are still recognized and respected. Her contributions to Moses' mission and to the understanding of God's guidance for humanity echo through the stories of faith and perseverance that shape Islamic belief. Zipporah's life, when viewed through a feminist lens, reveals a woman who navigated a patriarchal world with quiet strength and profound agency. In an era where women were often relegated to the background, her story offers subtle yet significant challenges to traditional gender roles. Though she is primarily known as Moses' wife, her actions reflect a depth of character that transcends the role typically assigned to women in ancient texts. Zipporah's role in supporting her husband and her intervention during critical moments reveal a woman whose contributions shaped not only her family, but the trajectory of a nation. From her first appearance in the biblical narrative, Zipporah is depicted as a woman of decisive action. When Moses, newly exiled from Egypt, encounters her at a well, it is Zipporah who takes the initiative to ensure that Moses is cared for. In the cultural context of ancient Midian, women were responsible for drawing water, but Zipporah's act of offering Moses hospitality goes beyond the traditional expectations. She serves as the bridge between Moses and her father Jethro, thereby ensuring that Moses finds refuge in Midian. This moment reflects her autonomy within her cultural and familial setting, a reflection of her ability to make choices that impact the course of Moses' journey. Her role takes a dramatic turn when Moses, having received his divine calling, prepares to return to Egypt. It is Zipporah who, in a moment of urgency, saves Moses' life by circumcising their son to prevent a divine punishment. In this instance, Zipporah's decisive action challenges the passivity typically ascribed to women in ancient religious stories. Rather than being a mere supporter or follower of Moses, she actively participates in ensuring the success of God's plan for her husband and their people. This episode, though often overshadowed by the larger narrative of Moses' mission, highlights Zipporah as a woman who uses her agency to respond to the divine in a way that is both protective and profound. Moreover, Zipporah's role as a wife and mother in the wilderness, where she must support Moses in his leadership, offers a rich interpretation of her contributions. She is not a figure of secondary importance, but a key figure in the narrative. As Moses grapples with the burdens of leading the Israelites, Zipporah's sacrifices are implicit in the text, though not always celebrated. Her life with Moses is one of constant adaptation, where she must bear the weight of his leadership while also caring for their children, embodying the emotional labor of sustaining a family in the midst of extraordinary circumstances. Zipporah's story challenges the traditional patriarchal framework by showcasing a woman who is not only an active participant in the narrative, but also a necessary agent of change. Her life presents a counter-narrative to the often passive roles women are given in ancient texts. Zipporah's strength lies not in overt rebellion, but in her quiet resistance against the confines of her societal role, carving out a place for herself in the unfolding drama of history. Through her, we see how women in patriarchal societies often exert influence in ways that are not always acknowledged, but are nonetheless integral to the progression of their families, cultures, and even nations. Zipporah's silence throughout the biblical narrative is one of the most striking and symbolic aspects of her character. Though she plays a critical role in the unfolding events, her words are few, and this absence of vocal expression invites deeper reflection. In a world where many of the male figures in the narrative are given lengthy speeches and dialogues, Zipporah's quiet presence speaks volumes. Her silence is not one of passivity, but of profound strength, wisdom, and purpose. Her relative silence may stem from cultural and historical expectations of women, where their roles were often subordinated to those of men, and their voices were seldom heard in the public arena. Yet, Zipporah's quiet moments reveal a woman who communicates more with her actions than with words. It is through these actions, rather than speeches, that Zipporah shapes the narrative around her. The most obvious example of her powerful silence occurs in the episode where Moses faces the threat of death, and Zipporah, without hesitation, circumcises their son to save him. This is an act of defiance against the divine order, an intervention that transcends spoken word. By taking this action in silence, she exhibits a deep understanding of the situation and the courage to act decisively, knowing that her choice is the only one that can alter the course of their lives. Zipporah's silence also operates on a more symbolic level. As Moses' partner, she is witness to the immense burdens of his leadership, the overwhelming demands of his mission, and the tumultuous relationship he has with the Israelites. Yet, despite the constant upheaval, Zipporah does not speak out or demand attention. Instead, she becomes a mirror of quiet resilience, bearing the emotional weight of the situation while staying steadfast in the background. In a society where women's voices were often overlooked, Zipporah's silence underscores her inner strength and determination. She chooses, at times, to remain in the background, letting Moses lead while she supports him through her actions and sacrifices. Her silence is not passive resignation. It is an expression of her choice to be a quiet pillar, holding up her family and her faith. Moreover, her silence in the narrative draws attention to the complexity of her character. While Moses is celebrated as the great leader, Zipporah, in her quiet wisdom, provides balance and grounding. Her strength lies in knowing when to speak and when to remain silent, understanding that sometimes the most powerful form of communication is not through words but through action. She offers a counterpoint to the often loud and overt expressions of power, instead demonstrating that strength can be found in subtlety, in knowing when to step aside and when to intervene. Zipporah's silence, then, serves as a symbol of the power that lies in restraint, in waiting, and in the quiet moments of sacrifice that truly define her character. In a world dominated by the voices of men, Zipporah's quiet strength becomes all the more remarkable, reminding us that sometimes the most profound truths are spoken without a single word. Zipporah's spiritual journey is a quiet yet profound evolution, one marked by her deep connection to the divine through her actions, her marriage to Moses, and her unique place in the unfolding story of Israel's deliverance. Though she is not the central figure in the biblical narrative, her relationship with God reveals a complex, nuanced spirituality that transcends simple devotion. Her journey begins long before her encounter with Moses. As the daughter of Jethro, a priest of Midian, Zipporah's early life was steeped in a different religious context than that of the Israelites. The Midianites, though not of the covenantal people, had their own form of worship and understanding of the divine. This background would have shaped Zipporah's spiritual outlook, giving her a perspective that was at once open and inquisitive, yet grounded in her heritage. Her faith was undoubtedly influenced by the practices of her people, yet her marriage to Moses would lead her into the fold of the God of Israel. When Moses arrived in Midian, a fugitive from Egypt, Zipporah's relationship with him brought her into direct contact with the God who had called Moses to deliver the Israelites. This was not a simple shift, but a transformation in her spiritual identity. Zipporah, whose understanding of the divine was rooted in the traditions of her father's priesthood, would now be asked to accept a new and more powerful vision of God, one that would change her life and her family's destiny. As Moses went through his own spiritual awakening at the burning bush, Zipporah's evolution was one of silent but profound partnership. She became part of a larger spiritual story, though her role was often relegated to the background. Nevertheless, her choice to marry Moses and bear children in the midst of his divine calling signifies a deep spiritual trust, one that would later manifest in her decisive actions during the circumcision incident, where her swift and brave decision to intervene preserved Moses' life and fulfilled God's purpose. Zipporah's spirituality is perhaps most clearly demonstrated in her role during the Exodus. Although she is not vocal in her devotion, her actions reveal a profound understanding of divine will. Through the hardships of the wilderness, the plagues, and Moses' leadership, Zipporah's quiet support reflects a woman who has found her place within God's broader plan. She understands that Moses' mission, though burdensome, is divinely ordained, and her role, though not always in the spotlight, is indispensable. Her spiritual journey does not demand recognition. Instead, it is defined by a steady commitment to her family, her husband, and the God who guides them. Her spiritual significance lies in the subtlety of her faith. While Moses receives the direct commands of God, Zipporah serves as a quiet vessel of divine wisdom, supporting him through unsung sacrifices. In choosing to stand by Moses through the difficult moments when others might have abandoned or protested, Zipporah shows her trust in God's purpose. Her journey is not about the grandeur of her role, but the depth of her actions, which reflect a profound understanding of faith's true meaning: quiet obedience, steady support, and the willingness to act when called upon. In this way, Zipporah's spirituality is a reflection of the deeper truths that often remain hidden beneath the surface of grand narratives. Zipporah's role in the redemptive narrative of Israel, though often subtle, is integral to the unfolding story of God's salvation plan for his people. From the moment she enters the biblical story, she is caught up in a divine plan that transcends her individual life and becomes part of the greater journey of Israel's deliverance from slavery in Egypt. While Moses is the central figure in this narrative, Zipporah's actions and decisions set the stage for the fulfillment of God's promises to Israel. Her first significant role in this redemptive plan comes early in her marriage to Moses. When Moses returns to Egypt to answer God's call, Zipporah's support is crucial. Her decision to marry Moses, a man on a mission ordained by God, is not just a personal commitment but a stepping stone in the larger narrative of God's work among the Israelites. Zipporah's acceptance of Moses' calling, despite the uncertainties and the dangers it posed to her family, reflects her own submission to the will of God, even when she may not fully understand its implications. The most pivotal moment in her involvement comes during the circumcision incident, when God sought to kill Moses on their journey back to Egypt. Zipporah's quick thinking and courage in circumcising their son, despite the cultural and emotional significance of this act, was a direct intervention in God's redemptive plan. Her decision to act in that moment, saving Moses' life, allowed him to continue his mission of leading Israel out of bondage. In this act, Zipporah not only preserved her family but also ensured that the leader of Israel would be able to fulfill the calling that would ultimately lead to the salvation of a nation. As Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, Zipporah's role remained quietly supportive. She, though not at the forefront of the people's liberation, was a foundational part of the behind-the-scenes efforts that helped Moses endure the trials and hardships of leading a nation out of slavery. Theologically, Zipporah's actions reflect the nature of God's work in the world, often carried out through quiet, hidden acts of faith and obedience. Her role emphasizes the idea that God's plan for redemption is not always enacted in grand public displays, but often through private moments of faithfulness, decision-making, and courage. In the broader theological context, Zipporah's involvement in the redemptive narrative reveals the importance of both public and private obedience in the fulfillment of God's will. She was not the one to part the Red Sea or deliver the commandments, but her actions at key moments of Israel's journey, especially her decisive intervention to save Moses, were crucial in ensuring that God's redemptive plan for Israel was not hindered. Zipporah's story reminds us that redemption is a collective effort, with each individual, whether in the spotlight or in the shadows, playing a part in the salvation story. Through her quiet, powerful role, Zipporah contributes to the broader tapestry of God's redemptive work, showing that every action, no matter how seemingly small, can be a part of God's divine purpose. Throughout history, Zipporah has captured the imaginations of artists, writers, and thinkers, though her portrayal has often been nuanced and varied. In art and literature, she is typically seen through the lens of her relationship to Moses, but her role and character are often given diverse interpretations, depending on the context of the narrative. From the ancient world to the modern era, Zipporah has been represented as both a supporting figure and a symbol of strength, courage, and faith. In early religious art, Zipporah was often depicted in the shadows of Moses, fulfilling her role as a wife and mother, yet her character was sometimes explored in more intimate or symbolic ways. In many medieval and Renaissance paintings, where biblical stories were frequently illustrated, Zipporah is shown in scenes of domesticity, a quiet figure, often near Moses or involved in family life. These depictions reflect the cultural views of the time, where women were often relegated to secondary roles in the larger theological story, with their identities defined through their relationships with male figures. However, in some of these representations, particularly in works from the late medieval period, Zipporah's intervention in the circumcision episode is sometimes highlighted as a pivotal, momentous act, pointing to her importance in ensuring Moses' survival. Literary interpretations of Zipporah's character have evolved over time as well. In the biblical narrative, her role is more passive compared to the likes of Sarah or Rachel, who are frequently portrayed as central figures in their own right. Nonetheless, in more contemporary retellings, Zipporah has been reimagined as a woman of strength and agency. Some writers have focused on her status as a foreigner, which introduces a layer of complexity to her relationship with Moses and the Israelite community. Her identity as a Midianite, in contrast with the Hebrews, provides a unique perspective on the intersection of culture, religion, and identity. This distinction has led to interpretations that portray Zipporah not merely as a wife in Moses' narrative, but as a bridge between different peoples and traditions, contributing to Israel's understanding of inclusion and divine intervention. In modern literature, Zipporah's character is often reinterpreted to give her more autonomy and depth, and her silence is sometimes seen as symbolic of her inner strength. She is presented not just as Moses' wife, but as a woman who plays a crucial, though understated, role in the fulfillment of God's plan. Writers have explored her emotional and spiritual journey, depicting her as a woman who, while quiet, exerts influence in subtle yet powerful ways. In these retellings, Zipporah is no longer merely a background figure but a key participant in the unfolding drama of God's work in the world. In visual and literary representations of biblical narratives, Zipporah's place fluctuates between being an underappreciated figure and a deeply significant character. As time has passed, artists and writers have taken greater strides to give her the attention she deserves, acknowledging her courage, wisdom, and faith. Through these evolving interpretations, Zipporah's legacy continues to grow, resonating across generations as a symbol of quiet strength and profound loyalty in the biblical story. Zipporah's influence on the leadership of Israel, though often subtle, cannot be understated. While she may not have held formal power in the way that Moses did, her presence, decisions, and support played a crucial role in shaping the trajectory of Israel's leadership. From the moment she became Moses' wife, Zipporah was a part of his journey, offering quiet yet essential support as he took on the monumental task of leading a people out of bondage. Her influence extended far beyond the domestic realm, affecting the way Moses governed and the way leadership would evolve within the nascent Israelite nation. Moses, in many ways, was the quintessential leader guided by divine calling, committed to fulfilling his mission. But leadership in the ancient world, particularly under such extraordinary circumstances, was not a solitary endeavor. Zipporah's actions, both the sacrificial ones, such as the circumcision of their son, and her willingness to follow Moses into unknown territories, served as a reminder to Moses that leadership often requires collaboration and personal sacrifice. Her understanding of her role as Moses' partner, even when she had no official status or recognition, subtly influenced how Moses approached the Israelites' leadership. She balanced him when he wavered, reminded him of his human side, and brought him back to his core purpose whenever the weight of his mission seemed overwhelming. In that way, she indirectly shaped the leadership he would offer to the Israelites, marking the beginning of a relationship between leaders and their supporters that would persist throughout Israel's history. Moreover, Zipporah's relationship with Moses also helped to shape the Israelites' understanding of leadership. The journey of Moses, from a prince of Egypt to the reluctant prophet, and the evolution of their partnership, mirrored the complex nature of leadership itself. In the wilderness, as Moses faced criticism and hardship, Zipporah's quiet but resilient support echoed the values of loyalty and sacrifice, emphasizing that true leadership is often a collective effort. The Israelites witnessed not only the grand acts of Moses' leadership, but also the personal dynamics that made his mission possible, chief among them, his partnership with Zipporah. Though Zipporah's role may have seemed peripheral at times, her legacy played a vital part in the formation of Israel's future governance. Her influence can be seen in the leadership structures that emerged in Israel, where the roles of prophets, kings, and advisors were often intertwined with familial and spiritual bonds. Zipporah, though never directly in charge of the nation's leadership, paved the way for a deeper understanding of what true leadership requires: compassion, wisdom, quiet strength, and an unyielding commitment to divine purpose. As the Israelites looked to Moses, they also saw the woman who stood beside him, supporting him through every challenge and shaping the legacy of governance for generations to come. Zipporah's role in interfaith dialogue is profound, as she serves as a shared figure in the religious traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Across these faiths, her story carries unique significance. offering insights into the relationship between God and his people, the challenges of leadership, and the role of women in divine narratives. Her place in the scriptures invites reflection on the commonalities that unite these three Abrahamic religions and how each tradition interprets her actions and character. In Judaism, Zipporah is a symbol of commitment, a partner to Moses who plays a critical, albeit often overlooked, role in the unfolding of the Israelites' journey. She embodies qualities of resilience and devotion, particularly in moments when she intervenes to protect Moses and their family, such as when she circumcises their son in a pivotal moment of divine wrath. Judaism, with its focus on Moses as the greatest prophet, also recognizes Zipporah's contributions within the context of his leadership, reminding the faithful that behind every leader is often a quiet but powerful force of support and sacrifice. Christianity, while focusing on the life and teachings of Jesus, also recognizes Zipporah through her connection to Moses, whom Christians see as a prefiguring figure of Christ. The parallels between Moses's mission to liberate the Israelites and the role of Jesus in bringing spiritual liberation are significant. Zipporah's role in this narrative, especially as the wife of Moses, highlights the theme of redemption, sacrifice, and divine calling that is central to Christianity. Her support for Moses mirrors the Christian idea of partnership in divine purpose, where individuals are called to walk alongside one another in the fulfillment of God's will, even in the face of great challenges. In Islam, Zipporah, known as ZIPPORAH, is also an important figure. Though less detailed in the Quran, her role as the wife of Moses is acknowledged, with her character embodying virtues of patience and support during Moses's prophetic mission. Islam emphasizes the collaboration between Moses and his wife, presenting Zipporah as a symbol of loyalty and strength in the service of God. The Quran, while focusing on Moses's divine mission, implicitly invites reflection on the role of those who support the chosen ones, showing how Zipporah's faithfulness contributes to the success of Moses' mission. What is remarkable across these traditions is how Zipporah's story fosters interfaith understanding. In Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, she is not merely a passive figure but an active participant in the divine plan. Her actions transcend specific religious contexts, offering a universal message of partnership, sacrifice, and devotion. She represents the ways in which faith and action intertwine, and how the journey of one individual Moses is supported and shaped by others, even those whose roles seem less central. Zipporah's presence in each of these traditions offers a common ground, a point of connection that encourages deeper understanding between these three great faiths. Her life invites interfaith dialogue, providing a shared story that emphasizes the importance of collaboration, faithfulness, and the power of individual contributions to a greater divine plan. Zipporah's role in Moses's life is shrouded in mystery, her character often appearing in the background of a larger narrative, yet one that is crucial to understanding the full scope of Moses's mission. Much about her early life and the reasons behind her marriage to Moses remain unanswered, leaving theologians and scholars to speculate on her background and motivations. The scant details offered about Zipporah in the Bible create a sense of intrigue, and her story invites multiple interpretations, reflecting the complexities of her character and the role she played in the grand narrative of Israel's liberation. We know that Zipporah was the daughter of Jethro, a priest of Midian, and that she met Moses during his time in exile, a period of great personal upheaval for Moses after he fled Egypt. She was the one who, with quick thinking, saved Moses from divine wrath when she circumcised their son, a pivotal moment that highlights her courage and wisdom. Yet beyond these key moments, little is revealed about her personality or her journey before this encounter. Why did Zipporah choose to marry Moses, a man she likely knew little about at the time? What were her own spiritual beliefs and how did they evolve during her marriage? These are questions that remain unanswered, yet they shape our understanding of her as a figure of significance in the life of Moses. In the narrative, Zipporah's role is often underplayed, especially when compared to the prominence of Moses. She supports Moses, but she is not the central figure, and her thoughts and emotions are rarely explored in detail. This lack of depth in her character has led to various theological interpretations, each seeking to understand the mystery of her role. Some scholars see her as a woman of quiet strength, a symbol of faithful support who played a vital, though understated, part in the unfolding of God's plan. Others view her as a figure who challenges traditional expectations, particularly in her ability to make decisive and bold choices when the situation demands it, such as when she circumcises their son to save Moses' life. From a narrative perspective, Zipporah's character is often seen as a foil to Moses' more public and commanding presence. Her role as a wife, mother, and the daughter of a priest places her at the intersection of Moses' divine mission and his personal life. Yet the mystery of her inner thoughts and motivations serves to emphasize the complexity of her character. Is she driven by duty, love, or faith? Her silent strength, particularly in moments of crisis, invites a deeper reflection on the nature of leadership, partnership, and sacrifice. Zipporah's story, though enigmatic, speaks volumes about the hidden dynamics in the lives of those who walk alongside great figures. Her role in Moses' life, while not fully explored, is critical. In her silence, her choices, and her presence, Zipporah embodies the quiet power of support, the mystery of God's purpose, and the strength found in the margins of a larger story. Theologically, her complex character reminds us that not all those who contribute to divine plans are meant to be in the spotlight. Some play their roles in the shadows, leaving a legacy that is felt rather than seen. Zipporah's story, though integral to the larger narrative of Moses and the Exodus, ends with an understated silence that mirrors her quiet strength throughout her life. After the pivotal moments in their marriage, her bravery in saving Moses' life with the circumcision of their son, and her quiet support during Israel's most tumultuous times, she fades from the central narrative, her role no longer as visible as it once was. There is no grand farewell or detailed account of her final days, but the absence of her presence speaks volumes about the lasting impact she left on the biblical story. In the religious texts, Zipporah's life ends quietly, with little fanfare or explicit reference to her death. The Bible shifts focus to Moses' leadership of the Israelites, the plagues, and the journey through the wilderness, leaving Zipporah's story to remain in the background. Her departure from the narrative marks the conclusion of her part in the divine mission, but it also reflects the complex role she played, often silent, but always present. The lack of closure in her story highlights the unspoken nature of her contribution. As Moses' partner, she played an essential, albeit underappreciated, part in the establishment of the Israelites as a people. The absence of detailed accounts of Zipporah's death or last moments leaves space for reflection on her legacy. In her relationship with Moses, she was not only a supportive wife but a key figure in the divine plan. Her role in shaping Moses' leadership and supporting him in moments of crisis was indispensable, even though her actions were sometimes overshadowed by the monumental events surrounding the Exodus. Zipporah's legacy is not one of prominence or public recognition, but of quiet, steadfast support, courage, and wisdom. She represents the many unseen figures in history whose sacrifices and decisions ripple through time, shaping events in ways that are not always immediately apparent. Though her departure from the biblical narrative is abrupt, Zipporah's influence endures in both the spiritual and historical contexts of Israel. Her Midianite heritage, her actions in the wilderness, and her role as Moses' wife all contributed to the foundation of a new nation. In the history of Israel's leadership, she remains an example of resilience and quiet strength, her presence felt even in her absence. Theologically, her story provides a subtle but profound reflection on the power of supportive partnership in fulfilling divine purpose and the importance of unsung roles in the unfolding of spiritual history. In the broader scope of biblical history, Zipporah's legacy continues to inspire reflection on the uncelebrated figures who shape the course of divine events. Her life, though not marked by dramatic finales or grand achievements, reminds us that not all acts of greatness are visible, and that sometimes the quietest figures leave the most lasting impressions on history and spirituality. Her departure from the narrative may be quiet, but the impact of her presence in Moses' journey resonates through the ages. Zipporah's role in the Exodus narrative, though often overshadowed by the towering figures of Moses and the grand events of liberation, is an integral part of a larger story about the silent yet powerful contributions of women. In the Exodus, women were not merely passive figures. They played active and decisive roles, each contributing in their own unique way to the unfolding of God's plan. Zipporah, though not in the foreground of the narrative, finds her place in this larger collective effort through her courage, wisdom, and support for Moses. In the context of Israel's liberation, women were crucial in moments of faith, resistance, and preservation. One of the most notable figures is Miriam, Moses' sister, who is directly involved in the leadership and spiritual guidance of the people. The Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, defied Pharaoh's orders to kill the newborn Hebrew boys, saving countless lives and helping to ensure the survival of the Israelites. These women, along with Zipporah, represent a powerful force of resistance and survival. They acted quietly, behind the scenes, but their courage and faith were key in sustaining the Israelites through oppression and exile. Zipporah's role, while subtle, cannot be underestimated. She was not merely a passive wife to Moses. She was a participant in the life-changing events that led to the Exodus. Her bravery in circumcising her son in the wilderness to save Moses' life was not just a personal act of devotion, but a powerful statement of her commitment to the divine mission. In that moment, Zipporah stood as a woman of action, making a difficult decision under extreme circumstances. She embodied the quiet strength that women throughout the Exodus demonstrated, facing danger, hardship, and uncertainty with unwavering resolve. Her actions helped to ensure that Moses could continue his journey as the leader of Israel. While Moses received the public recognition for leading the Israelites out of Egypt, it was the collective, often unseen, efforts of women like Zipporah that made the liberation possible. They were the ones who nurtured, protected, and ensured that God's plan for Israel's future would continue. Zipporah's place in the Exodus narrative is not just as Moses' wife, but as a part of this collective effort of women who, in their various ways, helped to steer the course of history. In the larger story of liberation, Zipporah's story highlights the overlooked but essential contributions of women, demonstrating that the path to freedom was not only forged through mighty acts of leadership, but also through the quiet courage of women who stood steadfast in their faith. Their stories remain vital to understanding the richness of the Exodus narrative and the pivotal role women played in the formation of a nation. Zipporah, alongside others, helped weave the fabric of the Israelite journey and the eventual liberation from Egypt. As the years passed, Zipporah's role in the unfolding story of Israel's liberation became quieter, though her presence and impact remained integral to the narrative. The challenges Moses faced as a leader of the Israelites took a toll on his marriage and family life, and Zipporah, once a vital partner in his mission, found herself gradually separated from the front lines of the Exodus. The reasons for this separation are not fully explored in the biblical text, but it is clear that Zipporah's life shifted as Moses' responsibilities grew heavier and more focused on leading the Israelites toward the Promised Land. During the years of Israel's wandering in the wilderness, Moses' leadership became all-consuming. The intense pressure of guiding a people through the wilderness, managing their complaints, and continually striving to fulfill the divine plan left little room for the intimacy that once defined Moses and Zipporah's relationship. At some point, Zipporah returned to her family in Midian, either out of necessity or as a result of the growing distance between her and Moses. This exile from her husband is symbolic, reflecting the broader sense of separation and isolation that Moses experienced during his leadership. As the weight of his role as a prophet and lawgiver deepened, Moses's personal connections seemed to fade into the background, and Zipporah, once a key figure in his life, was largely left behind. Even in her absence from the central narrative, Zipporah's impact lingered. Her decisions, particularly the pivotal moment when she saved Moses's life in the wilderness, reverberated through the story of Israel's journey. She had been a witness to the earliest days of the Exodus and had played a crucial part in Moses's calling. Though no longer directly involved in the leadership or the miracles that followed, her influence in Moses's early life remained a guiding force. She was not just the wife of Moses. She was a part of the early foundation upon which Israel's journey was built. In the context of Israel's exodus, Zipporah's final years hold a bittersweet quality. Though she was separated from Moses, her legacy in the broader story of the Israelites continued. The leadership that Moses provided was deeply shaped by his early life, which was shared with Zipporah. The quiet strength she displayed in those early days, particularly in her actions surrounding their children and the challenges she faced as a wife of a reluctant prophet, set a tone that would echo throughout the difficult years ahead. In her later years, Zipporah was no longer the focal point of the Exodus narrative, but her contributions had already played a vital role. Her influence, both as a wife and as a mother, resonated within the broader context of Israel's journey toward the Promised Land, leaving an indelible mark on the spiritual and cultural heritage of the nation. Zipporah's presence in Moses's life had a profound impact on both his personal journey and his role as a leader. When Moses first encountered God's calling in the wilderness, it was Zipporah who stood by him, offering both her support and wisdom in the face of the uncertainties that lay ahead. Though Moses was initially reluctant and full of self-doubt, Zipporah's quiet strength and the support she provided in the early days gave him a sense of stability. Her commitment to him, even through the most difficult of circumstances, became a silent anchor for Moses as he stepped into the role of the great liberator of Israel. In many ways, Zipporah shaped Moses's leadership style without ever stepping directly into the spotlight. Her role in the circumcision of their son, when Moses's life was in danger, revealed a sharp understanding of the divine and an intuitive grasp of God's will in times of crisis. She acted swiftly, saving Moses's life and, by extension, securing the future of the Israelites. In this act alone, Zipporah displayed a decisive strength and clarity that contrasted with Moses's more hesitant nature at the time. It was in moments like these that Zipporah helped Moses find his footing not just as a husband or father, but as a prophet of God's plan. Through her, Moses was reminded of the importance of faith and obedience, even in the face of fear and confusion. As Moses continued his mission to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, Zipporah's influence remained crucial, even if less overt. Her support allowed Moses to focus on the monumental task of freeing a nation. Yet, the personal cost of leadership also became evident. Moses, whose responsibilities as a prophet and lawgiver grew with each passing day, found himself often distanced from Zipporah. The immense pressure of guiding the Israelites through the wilderness and establishing a new covenant with God took a toll on their relationship. Still, Zipporah's contributions behind the scenes were undeniable. She helped bear the emotional weight of Moses's leadership, providing the grounding he needed, even if it meant sacrificing her own desires and needs for the greater good of the people. Their relationship was far from conventional, particularly in a time when patriarchal structures defined much of society. Zipporah's ability to maintain her sense of self, while also supporting Moses's divine mission, carried political ramifications as well. Through Moses's leadership, Israel was not only guided to freedom, but was also set on a path of spiritual transformation. And Zipporah's impact on that transformation was pivotal. She embodied a quieter, more behind-the-scenes role, yet one that shaped the course of history. In the personal and political realms, Zipporah's relationship with Moses laid the foundation for the leadership that would eventually define the nation of Israel. Without her influence, Moses might not have been able to lead with the clarity and conviction that he did. Her strength, wisdom, and support provided Moses with the balance he needed to fulfill his divine purpose, making her an unsung but critical figure in Israel's journey from slavery to freedom. Zipporah's legacy, though often overshadowed by the dramatic events surrounding her husband Moses, carries a lasting significance in the three Abrahamic faiths: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Across these traditions, her story offers varying perspectives on her role, but she remains an integral part of the broader narrative of Moses' life and Israel's journey. In Jewish thought, Zipporah is primarily seen through the lens of her marriage to Moses and the pivotal moments she influenced, particularly her actions in protecting Moses during the circumcision incident. Jewish interpretations emphasize her role as a devoted wife and mother, her connection to the Midianite priestly tradition, and her contribution to the survival of Israel's leader. While her presence in Jewish texts is often subtle, her legacy as part of the foundation of Moses' prophetic leadership is recognized. Her actions, especially her quick thinking in the wilderness, symbolize the quiet yet crucial support that often goes unnoticed in the stories of Israel's great leaders. Christian thought, meanwhile, tends to focus more on her role in relation to Moses' mission. Zipporah's actions, such as her decisive role in circumcising their son, take on symbolic significance in Christian theology. Some Christian interpretations see her as a figure representing obedience to God's commandments, even when faced with uncertainty and personal sacrifice. While Zipporah is less emphasized than other women in the Bible, her presence provides a nuanced understanding of the relationships within God's divine plan. Christianity often portrays her as a support figure who, through her quiet strength and faith, helps Moses fulfill his destiny as a leader of Israel, furthering God's covenant with the people. In Islamic tradition, Zipporah is honored but plays a more subdued role than in Judaism or Christianity. The Quran does not specifically mention her by name, but her story is acknowledged in various hadiths and Islamic commentary. Islam views her as a virtuous woman who stood by her husband during his trials and supported him in fulfilling God's will. While her role in the Islamic narrative is less detailed, Zipporah is recognized as an example of faithfulness and devotion to her husband and to God. The emphasis in Islam is on her partnership with Moses as they work together to lead the Israelites, emphasizing the importance of supporting one's spouse in fulfilling divine purpose. Despite the varying interpretations of her life, Zipporah's influence in shaping the narrative of Moses and Israel is undeniable across all three faiths. Her presence in these stories signifies the strength and resilience of women behind the scenes, playing essential roles in the fulfillment of divine plans. While her legacy is often quieter than that of other figures in the biblical and Quranic stories, Zipporah's influence endures in how each tradition views leadership, obedience, and partnership in the face of divine calling. Her legacy, therefore, is not only shaped by her actions but also by the symbolic and theological roles she plays in each tradition, creating a lasting influence on the narratives that define the Abrahamic faiths. Zipporah's presence in the biblical narrative is shrouded in mystery, her role often understated yet profoundly impactful. While many key figures in the story of Moses are given clear and expansive arcs, Zipporah's story remains fragmented, leaving much about her to the imagination. The details of her life before meeting Moses are largely unknown, as is much of her inner world and personal motivations. What is clear, however, is the essential role she played in the larger story of Israel's liberation and in the formation of Moses as a leader and prophet. Her first appearance, when she meets Moses at a well and later becomes his wife, sets the stage for a deep connection between two individuals who would together shape the course of history. Yet, her presence is often marked by silence. Zipporah does not engage in lengthy speeches or take center stage in grand theological discussions, but her actions speak volumes. The incident with the circumcision of their son, for instance, reveals a woman capable of quick, decisive action in moments of crisis. In that act, she saved Moses' life, standing as a protector in a moment of spiritual and physical danger. This rare but crucial intervention encapsulates the essence of her character, resourceful, resolute, and supportive without seeking the spotlight. Throughout the Exodus story, Zipporah's voice is seldom heard, yet she provides the silent, steadfast support that Moses needs as he fulfills his divine calling. Her quiet strength reflects the broader theme of women in the Bible, who often contribute significantly to the unfolding of God's plan while remaining in the background. This reflects a paradox of her presence. While the male leaders take the spotlight, it is the women who often hold the foundational roles that sustain the journey. The spiritual legacy of Zipporah lies in her obedience, her partnership with Moses, and her role in the foundational moments of Israel's history. She embodies a quiet faithfulness to her husband and to God's plan, serving as a bridge between Moses' mission and the people of Israel. Her Midianite background also brings a nuanced cultural and spiritual perspective to the narrative, highlighting the intersections of diverse traditions in the formation of Israel as a people. While not overtly discussed in theological discourse, Zipporah represents an important figure in the spiritual tapestry of the Bible. The enduring mystery of Zipporah's life remains one of the intriguing aspects of her legacy. She is a woman who, despite her silence and seeming lack of prominence, played an irreplaceable role in the greatest story of liberation. In the absence of detailed personal narratives, she becomes a symbol of all those who contribute to the fulfillment of God's will in ways that are quiet but vital. Her legacy, though veiled in mystery, endures through her actions, her symbolism, and her place as an integral part of the unfolding divine plan. In the grand sweep of biblical history, Zipporah's influence lingers, reminding us that the greatest stories are often told not through words but through the silent strength of those who stand behind them.